the AC DC debate we have. Like we have the whole Thomas Edison like promoting electrocution, even though he doesn't believe in electrocution, because effectively he kind of promotes it as a way of discrediting his rivals.
Well, it is fascinating because in a way Thomas Edison was right. There are clear advantages of using DC current. However, the fact of highly increasing and then decreasing the voltage with the technology that was available for Edison wasn't there. So the fact that you try to do the voltage transformations, it's so much easier with AC current. However, with the technology with solid state electronics that we have available today, adjusting the voltage is very much doable. And as a result, if you think about high voltage transmission lines, when they go something above 50 kilometers underwater, or somewhere around 800 kilometers on surface, it is actually more affordable to transmit high DC voltage energy due to some of the losses that are coming from the reactance of the electrical system being totally disappeared. And so it's funny that it took 10 years to mature the supporting technologies to the level that the promise of DC as foreseen by Thomas Edison can really materialize. So I mean, he was right, but he was only 100 years too early with his opinion. And and it's fascinating.
It's absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, and I mean the other thing that is fascinating is that as a matter of fact, ASEA as well as Brown Boveri, they are companies that were essentially born pretty soon after the whole electricity as a phenomenon had been invented. So this is everything happening in the second half of the 19th century.
Now, you're completely right. Welcome to Category Leaders. This is the podcast where Marty and I tell the stories of the best in the world, based in Europe companies that have won their category globally. And today, as you already heard, before we get to the company, we need to begin with the force that this company harnessed, or the force that this was coming into the world. And these companies, because we're going to talk about two, basically brought its benefits to that world. Because electricity is one of the great shaping forces of the modern world. Once humans beings learned how to generate it, to move it, to control it, to apply it at scale, the world changed. So, cities grew differently, factories became vastly more capable, transport systems became more coordinated, industry became more precise, and society was just fundamentally different before electricity, and then as we harnessed it and got it to do more and more for us. So electricity is not just a useful input into modern life, it is arguably modern life. So that's why today we are giving you two for the price of one on Category Leaders. We're going to tell the story of ABB, but we're also going to tell the story of its forerunner companies. Because ABB is a relatively modern invention, modern being 1987, 1988 onwards, whereas the companies that basically formed it go back a century that. So we're digging into one of the companies that helped make electricity happen, not just in Europe, but across the world. And if you think back 100 plus years, electricity isn't industry. Electricity is carnival shows. It's pretty lights. It's men standing in front of an audience, getting them to scream with excitement where, a spark can go from one side to another. It's very much show and not an awful lot of productivity on a daily life. So what I find so powerful about ABB, and again, we're really going to dig into this company, it sits right at the point where electricity stops being theory and becomes capability. And again, we're starting this story with two households. We have one in Sweden and we have one in Switzerland, which itself is very exciting in terms of going around Europe. Yeah. And again, it's the ABB company that they then form actually becomes twice the size of their competitors. So if you've heard of companies like General Electric or Hitachi or Siemens, when ABB is created out of these two forerunners, it's twice the size of those. So this is a proper scaled company that is basically harnessing electricity and spreading it throughout the world.
And I want to say something fundamental here to begin with. What is electricity actually? I'd like to compare that with language. And what I mean with that? Electricity has actually turned out to be the lingua franca of energy. That's the easiest, that's the easiest manageable, transferable, controllable form of energy compared to any other energy sources. So be that fossil fuels, nuclear, wind, solar, the common communication layer actually happens with electricity. So all these other various forms of energy that we have, they are all essentially converted to energy to be then further used and benefited in the various applications. So it is like English language in the modern business today, and that's why I like the idea of using the word lingua franca for energy in this connection. And when it comes to ABB and its predecessor companies, Brown Boveri and ASEA, surprisingly, they were both actually born more or less at the same time when the whole electricity was founded. I mean, we are talking about the peers of Thomas Alva Edison, who was in the forefront of this whole phenomenon. That's when electricity all of a sudden established these new companies. So in a way, it's like invention of AI all of a sudden creating new companies, startups who are trying to create business out of it, exactly the same way Brown Boveri and ASEA originally were established. And what we have today, we have, last year's figures, 29 billion euros of revenues, around 32 billion euros worth of orders, 111,000 employees, and more than 160 manufacturing sites all around the world. So the company has developed tremendously and is not just living off an old reputation from last century. This is a serious company that is deep inside the global economy, even if a normal consumer is not necessarily very much exposed to ABB as such. And why this is so relevant today is that power demand is rising again. I mean, electrification, grids, robotics, AI data centers. We are talking about a huge expand, and actually the bottleneck resource currently foreseen as being the electrical grid and the available of electrical energy. I mean, it's some of these calculations on AI data centers is that with this level of growth in some years, the AI data centers would consume all the energy that we have available. So as a result, the ability to be efficient in both generation of energy and then managing, conditioning, converting the energy into different uses all around the society is more important than ever. So even if there's a lot of energy available, the energy efficiency has turned out to be a critical success factor for all these companies. ABB as a company started in 1988 as a result of the merger, but we are probably not going to be starting from there. We go to the original story and how both the Brown Boveri side and ASEA side started. So any idea, Colin, how would you want to tackle this whole issue?
So I think, Marty, I think you said that very well. Electricity is the force that runs throughout this story. And listeners, we're going to tell the story of two houses, right? Think Romeo and Juliet, two houses, each alike, and there's every similar exploration of technology. So we begin our story in 1883. And as Marty said, despite starting in the 19th century, this part is going to feel pretty familiar because electricity is a general purpose technology. And in 1883, electricity felt like this. The science is moving quickly. The engineering is difficult. The commercial form is not settled. And yet, the most serious people in industry, the most outspoken people in the world, Thomas Edison, Nicholas Tesla, etc., are working on this, right? There are laboratories pushing theory forward, engineers trying to make the thing work, industrialists trying to work out where the value will actually pool, and investors trying to understand the map and knowing that fortunes are going to be made, but where do they place their bets? And in that atmosphere, and just be clear, I've just described the conditions for AI, but it's also the conditions in 1883 for electricity. In that atmosphere, Europe produces two remarkable houses, or we should really say answers to this. What do we do with the general purpose technology at the frontier? So the first is Swedish. And the reason that matters is Sweden is not seeing as electricity as a kind of a fashion accessory. Sweden in the 1880s is very much an industrial player. It's a large country. It has mines and rivers and metal and timbers and railways. This is not IKEA. This is not Spotify. This is not, lovely Sweden with a cup of coffee. This is industrial Sweden, right? So effectively, if electricity is going to matter in Sweden, it has to be able to travel these distances in a large country. It has to power the machinery and it has to connect these industrial sites. So the Swedish beginning, the Swedish house, basically starts with solving a real problem, which is how do they move electricity from point A to point B? Because point A is where it's produced and point B is where it's needed. And that's the Swedish problem.
Yeah, and I mean the problem, of course, that if we think about the 1880s, the typical solution is that yes, in both Sweden and Finland, you had a lot of hydromechanical power, and it means that if you need a factory, like a lot of the textile industry was using hydromechanical power in those days, you need to build a factory next to the rapids or the waterfall where you gain all the energy, and it is transmitted through pulleys and belts and axles to the machinery. It's quite a mechanical engineer's nightmare to keep that up and running. But in the 1883, Ludwig Fredholm and Jonas Wenström, they established the company Elektriska Aktiebolaget, which means essentially electrical company. And
great marketing.
Yes, great marketing. And then the name ASEA actually comes from Allmänna Svenska Elektriska Aktiebolaget, which means Swedish General Electric Company. It's funny, the connection to Thomas Edison and the establishment of GE more or less at the same time in United States. Anyway, the first major deal that they had was that there was hydro power available in Hellshön, and in about 15 kilometers away, 10 miles away, there was a factory, there was a mine in Grängesberg, an iron ore mine that needed the energy. So 10 miles away, there was a necessity of transmitting the energy. Well, it cannot be done. You cannot move the mine and you cannot move the source of energy. You need to connect these two. And they ended up building the first commercial 3-phase transmission line using 9.5 kilovolts voltage between these two locations. And why this matters in this whole thing is that the whole story came out of necessity. The customer had a real problem, not just a proof of concept, but an actual need of transmitting energy from one location to another for 15 kilometers. And rather than producing parts, individual components, ASEA started by supplying the entire system. So whatever was needed to transmit the energy, they came up with a solution. And there was an actual commercial problem, there was an actual customer requirement. And so nice to hear the beginning, because later on in the storyline, when we get to the more recent CEOs of ASEA and ABB, the customer focus has always been there, solving customer problems rather than pushing something that you happen to produce. And this is so critical. I mean, the other form of energy that we had those days was, of course, steam. but also steam. Then you need to hold the energy, the coals, for example, that you use to create the steam. That had to be hauled. So the very effective transportation of energy from one location to another was the core, and ASEA was really making foundational work doing exactly that. And here also the three-phase electrical system is very important. First of all, it's a sign of times when the original battle between direct current and alternating current technology solutions ended up favoring the AC solutions, predominantly due to the ease of changing the voltage, and you needed to change the voltage from the use to the long distance transmission in order to reduce the energy that is lost in the process. And with AC, that's much easier. But this is not only AC, it's a three-phase AC, which turns out to be very, very efficient in controlling rotating motors, because you are creating with three phases, you are creating a rotating magnetic field, and you can make a very, very small and efficient motor to convert that electrical energy into motion once again. And this has very, very long-term benefits that we will see later on in this whole narrative. So this starts the system with that. There are of course challenges. AC has challenges related to reactance, the capacitance and the inductance of those transmission lines. There are losses that are not there, and one of the key things that many people don't necessarily remember is that for the proper functioning you need to have very, very stable frequency and very, very stable phase difference between these three phases. And why that matters? That matters because that is then introducing very early on, it introduces the science, technology and engineering tradition of ASEA. They knew that these problems have to be solved at the very, very high scientific level knowledge. And that's why engineering started to be in the core of the company, rather than being something that is outsourced for somebody else. The engineering skills and capabilities in this field of technology became to be in an integral part of the nature of ASEA from essentially day one.
And I love this, Marty, because obviously we study all these fantastic companies like EssilorLuxottica, like Roche, like ASML, and the stories are often very old. They go back into the 1890s, they go into the 1840s, 1980s with Airbus. And yet the seeds of the founding set the tone for like the next 100 years. What's the first problem that you solve? How technologically difficult is that first problem? Do you focus on the component? Do you focus on the system? And often that it's not just the founders, it's the problem that the founders take on, sets the tone, sets the culture, sets so much about these journeys going forward. Yeah. And again, it's not, sometimes we see founders who do a long time in the helm, right? You know, Leonardo De Vecchio at EssilorLuxottica is a fantastic example. But sometimes we see founders like we saw in Roche and like we see here, where the time that they spend is not that long, right? But the impact they have and the challenge that they take on sets the tone of the company, even if they've moved on.
Yeah. And I mean, the interesting side here is also that in case of ASEA and a lot of these innovations, they were actually patented. And it was Jonas Wenström who was the core person with all these technologies, and that essentially set the pace for the company going forward. And the technology was used in solving the customer's actual problems, and that even if there were a lot of technological risks. I mean, we are talking about the very dawn of electrical engineering here, but still, even if there were risks, there was a systems level party that is responsible, rather than outsourcing the integration of the system to the customer, who is required to buy all the individual components from different suppliers. And then when something fails, all these different suppliers are just blaming each other. No, ASEA took the full responsibility of the actual capability delivered. And that brings, of course, my favorite area, delivering capability for a military customer. The military customers are exactly in the same situation like the iron ore miner of the late 19th century. They are not interested in the gadgets. They need a capability, they need to have a problem solved, and they want to have a supplier who is taking full responsibility of the solution. That's how you deliver the capability. Now, the other thing which is, of course, interesting is that Sweden, like you already mentioned, was a very, very highly functioning engineering and industrial country in those days, and there were many other uses for this technology already inside the Swedish borders, and that gave them a growth path already from Finland, from Sweden and the nearby countries. So they didn't have the same urge to go international immediately. There was plenty to do in the immediate vicinity when this new technology came available.
Yeah, like there was plenty to do in Sweden, so which kind of sets ASEA's tone. But obviously, it's a little bit sad as well because we lose Jonas pretty early, you know. So he dies in 1893, and basically it's the same year this mine system, this 10-mile system comes into being. He's only 38, and he leaves a great legacy behind him. But as I said, sometimes the founders do a long stint at the helm, sometimes they don't. In this case, he's out sadly very soon on this particular side. But ASEA very much focuses on basically solving the problems for Sweden, basically delivering electricity over distance in a big country. But fortunately for us listeners, Europe does not offer one answer to general purpose technology that is electricity. It gives us two. So we just need to be clear, I think, Marty, what is a general purpose technology? Right? So again, we've used the term, but I think we should define it. So this is a technology not designed for one industry or task. This is something that spreads across large parts of the economy, and it continues to improve over time. And most importantly, it makes further innovation possible in the industries that adopt it. And again, we've seen some of this before: steam engine type technology, semiconductor type technology, are good and visible ways of saying this, but electricity is basically almost everything. Yeah. So AI is really the next GP, general purpose technology that we've seen, because electricity just spreads in so many different directions. And, again, it changes the way that you work across so many industries, in the way that AI, we can look forward to this, will change the way we work in so many different sectors as well. But now let's move the story on to Switzerland, right? Yes. So let's move to the other house. What's happening there?
Yeah. Well, the story of Brown Boveri starts in the city of Baden, which is a small Swiss industrial town around Zurich area, and Charles Brown and Walter Boveri are still working at the Maschinenfabrik Oerlikon, and they are, salaried employees. They have already experience from electrical machinery, and they understand the technology, they understand the transmission problems that you have. So that's clear. But especially Charles Brown has already established himself as a key electrical engineer of this early generation of double E's, and the guys, of course, see a business opportunity. The technology is coming out of laboratories, and these circus tricks that you mentioned already, and they want to build their own company to manufacture the machines and systems, which is quite understandable. The future and the financing are two completely different things, because they had the challenge to build and finance the company. They felt that they need 500,000 Swiss francs to begin properly, and for two salaried engineers, that was quite a lot of money. They approached banks and a number of investors that they knew, both in Switzerland but also in Germany, and they were turned down. So unproven technology, unproven entrepreneurship, slightly unexperienced founders, and it's not surprised that such a capital requirement sounded unrealistic, unreasonable, and they did have a challenge. So
it's all sounding very familiar, isn't it? It's the fact that we're
yeah,
talking
it's
about this in the 1890s, and we could have been talking about this like last week.
yeah, exactly, and then the good side of the story is the Pfister brothers, local figures in Baden. They came back from the Paris Exposition of 1889 and returned with a clear vision that, okay, electricity is going to be transforming modern life altogether. So they didn't merely want to illuminate one building or buy one generator or build one transmission line to move energy from one place to another. They wanted to make Baden as the modern city that works around electricity, and this clearly was also not something that you could buy from one single supplier at a time. This was not a catalog order, and to build a complete local electrical system, Brown and Boveri were being asked to help. How do you build all the machinery and all the systems in order to make this all happen? And this was the kind of problem that immediately gave. I mean, this was the business case that helped to launch the entire company. You had the river right there, and the river was available to be used as the source of the energy. But then you need to have all the equipment for converting that hydro power to electricity, and you have to be able to manage the voltage, etc., distribution system all across the town, and to do it in such a way that it is not just an exhibition that works somewhere as a demo. It needs to have immediately a number of users. You need to have a standard quality, repeatable performance, and reliability 24 hours a day. So a big issue. And this landmark deal was turning the entire town of Baden into an electrified town, and it launched the Brown Boveri Corporation.
And I love this because effectively the contrast between ASEA in Sweden, who basically have a company, have technology, have patents, find a customer, solve the customer's problem, iron ore, hydropower. And then Brown Boveri, which is effectively, we want to start a company, but we don't have the money. We kind of don't have the problem. We have the expertise. It's very Sergey Brin, Larry Page type stuff. And kind of like, and then the local kind of town merchants, the brothers that run this town are like, we've seen the future. Where do we find two young guys to basically make this happen? We'll give the financing. We'll give them a factory. And again, it starts with a bang, right? Because by 1891, they already have 100 workers and 24 salaried employees. You know, they're not two engineers in a shed. They actually have a factory. Pretty much, it happens very quick once they kind of get the go. And I think the contrast is lovely, right? It's one, company looking for a problem and a customer, and one couple of founders chancing their arm and basically ending up in the right place at the right time, and suddenly the magic happens.
Yeah, and I mean, of course, the other funny thing here is that the business case was there, but how did they solve the funding in the end? And the funding for the exercise came from a silk industrialist, Konrad Baumann, who was operating in Zurich. And he was willing to back the guys up when the banks were not available. And in order to show a full commitment, Walter Boveri goes all in and marries Baumann's daughter, Victoire. So I think it's funny how
there's a clear lesson for founders here.
Yes. So you
have to show commitment.
You have to show commitment, and you got to play all in. And of course, those guys who fail, we don't tell stories about, but the winners make very very nice stories in the end.
Oh
And
my
so
goodness.
it's great. It's so nice, and eventually, yes, like you said already, it's they started very very seriously with a serious side of company, and that was the launch. So, I mean, essentially, we have the two companies, Brown Boveri in Switzerland and ASEA in Sweden, and they started with very, very different kind of a problem. The and really the ASEA was the system supplier for specific problems, and Brown Boveri was really the company electrifying entire cities, societies. So a very, very different way, scalable business.
Yeah, and again, don't users think that one's easier than the other. These are both very difficult problems that these two companies are solving. And personally, obviously, somebody who called Colin Brown can't help but comment on somebody called Charles Brown, who is clearly a Swiss engineering genius, but obviously with a very British name, which I
Yeah,
love because effectively his father had come to Switzerland previously. He'd gone all in, he'd married local, and Charles grows up within the Swiss system, but with a very, very English name behind him, which I just absolutely love.
yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely. Okay, so we have now the two houses that are going to form the backstory of our story. You have the Swedish house is solving distance. The Swiss house is formed by assembling opportunity. They're both shaped by their geography at this stage, which is really quite funny, right? They're looking at the same technological map, but their geographical constraints and their business environments are creating almost different journeys for them. So the Swedish house is going to be very focused on Sweden for the foreseeable future because Sweden is 11 times bigger than Switzerland, right? It's a much bigger country and it has a lot of hydropower and a lot of kind of raw materials to do something with. And the Swiss house is going to very quickly run into the fact that Switzerland is a beautiful place, but it's a relatively small place. And actually, if it wants to make real money, it's going to have to get out of Switzerland because Switzerland is not going to contain it once they've started electrifying all the different places. So, again, if you're struggling a little bit, listeners, with these tales of 1890 or etc., just think about these companies in the way that you often think about OpenAI and Anthropic, right? So both of those two frontier labs are working on a general purpose technology. They are taking different paths. It's a little bit too early to say who's going to be winners, who's going to be losers, or whether they're both winners. But they're doing different things. They're reading the same technology, but they're approaching it in different ways. In the same vein, ASEA and Brown Boveri are looking at the same general purpose technology and coming up with different approaches. So, ASEA channels systems. Brown Boveri is a bit more open AI. It goes wider in terms of electrifying places, and they have different geographical constraints. So
Yeah.
that's where we kind of take it to.
Yes, and it's just like with AI today and some of the other leading technologies today, the founders matter. I mean, we already talked about Jonas Wenström, and he mattered because he essentially had the technical vision and the skill to create all these intellectual property when the company and when the technology was very young and the company was just started, and it's and his co-founder Ludwig Fredholm was equally important because he was the guy who essentially organized everything, had the commercial discipline, had the governance and the organizational models that were needed in the beginning. And Charles Brown and Walter Boveri, they both mattered very much in making the Brown Boveri Corporation story to fly. Of the Charles was the more technical guy, and Walter was the guy who was essentially the builder of the company and the whole organizational side of the whole thing.
Yeah. And again, listeners, the founders matter, but equally, sometimes you need somebody to come in and help run a real business. And as we said earlier, sadly, Wenstrom from ASEA doesn't last that long. And ASEA also gets itself into a little bit of financial difficulty pretty early on. So we need to introduce a new character at this stage. So you've got someone here, Marty, called Edstrom, Siegfried Edstrom. So he comes in pretty early into the business in 1903. So why does he matter?
Well, I mean, he matters. I mean, and it's with all the companies. If you start small, the challenges that you have with a small company in the very beginning, they are very different than the problems you have when you have 100 people, 500, 1,000, 2,000, 5,000 people, and any company, even the startups today, even if of course many founders feel that they are reinventing the wheel and they don't have to follow the bureaucracy of their predecessors because they have found a more agile way of running the business. Partly that is true. There are many, many lessons in the past that are better be left in the past. But when you are managing organizations, when you are managing large groups of people, you need to reinvent the the governance model, the management model, just because you cannot manage. And here in the case of Siegfried Edström, who came to ASEA in 1903, the way how you manage 1,100 employees, which was the number of people working for ASEA at the time, you need to have a different governance model just to make sure that even that the information is flowing within the organization. 1,100 is different than 100. And it's just something that everybody eventually will find out. And this reinvention of the governance model while you are on your way up is very, very, very important. Now Edström comes in, and he's the guy who is building the larger company, because this is no longer a small electrical venture with gifted people around it and everybody depending on a couple of founders who are know-it-all. Definitely not. When the technical credibility and the meaningful industrial scale has been achieved, then Edström is the guy who is reinventing the whole management of ASEA. At the same time, on the Brown Boveri side, what happens is that rather than having these original founders, the international growth is beginning to crystallize around Mannheim in Germany, little by little, where you all of a sudden need, it's not just company working in one country, you have two countries and an increasing importance. We talk about Mannheim later, so let's put a earmark to this page, and we'll get back to Mannheim and its importance. But definitely the internationalization of Brown Boveri is the core story on their side, on the Swiss side of our whole category leader.
And we're now entering kind of a critical part for both houses, because we're now up to 1914. And really, we've seen this in many stories before. This is a kind of make or break point for a lot of these companies. The First World War is coming. And the kind of, if you're kind of, as a listener, you've got so far the kind of the problem set is set for these houses. Their culture is kind of in place. They're scaling businesses. They're the General Electric Company of Sweden. But they're now coming into kind of war is going to rip Europe apart, right? And how these two houses deal with that is again another part of their story. So World War I starts on the 20th of July, 1914. Now, in comparison to some of our other category leaders that we've covered, the war affects them less than it does some of those other companies, because both Sweden and Switzerland have these long traditions of neutrality, long tradition in the context of about 100 years. So both countries have been broadly had a policy of neutrality dating back to the Napoleonic Wars, so basically the early 1815s. So this is different for them as opposed to Britain and France and Germany and Austria and everybody else that's kind of like, going at it at all. So neutrality matters for these guys, not so much from the philosophical sense, but really a little bit, Marty, it's going to probably sound a bit cold here. From a business sense, these guys could just keep on working while everybody's fighting.
Exactly. And And in a way, some people, of course, have been very critical for Sweden and Switzerland over this, that they essentially just remained in the audience and watching everybody else fight for their life. But definitely, it absolutely has helped both of these countries and the industries therein, that they were not wasting this huge amount of money and effort into destroying and rebuilding stuff.
Yeah. So again, bring your mind forward, listeners, to kind of the AI stuff. Who's distracted? Who's focused? Who's kind of at war? Who's kind of got their heads down and is just building very hard? So if your factories remain intact, if your engineers can keep working, yeah, if your managers are not dispersed, you can basically press your advantage. And it's at this stage, the neutrality for both countries helps these two companies really steal a march. So again, they're still very focused local. So ASEA is still very much the Swedish company. And, we mentioned Edstrom as a good example. So he arrives in 1903. The company has 1,100 employees. When he retires at 1949, and so he does serious time on the helm, 1903 to 1949, so after World War II, ASEA is over 10,000 employees and in 43 countries. It's still very Sweden focused, but it really expands during that 40-year period under Edstrom's leadership. So he really builds a substantial organization post kind of founder journey for them.
Yeah, and that's unbelievable if you think of it as with today's standards, to be at the helm for more than 40 years. It's very unusual. I mean, probably one of the very, very few examples that comes to mind today is Reinhold Wirth, who has been in the helm and now in the board of the family-owned company for decades and decades. Another interesting, actually, category leader probably in future that we should cover. But let's get back to Sweden. The tenure of Edström, one of the key things that he did very early on was building Västerås, which is a city in Sweden, and turns out to be a core city for ASEA going forward. And what did he do there? He opened the Central Research Facility, and this is very much in line with of course from the time from Jonas Wenström, that technology and engineering are in the core rather than being a shared service of some sort. It's the core value adding part of the whole company, and having it centralized in one place is of course is helping you to achieve the critical mass where engineers are easily sharing information with each other. And when we remember that now we are talking about times that are 110 years ago, having people in the very same location was very, very critical, because you didn't have Teams, you didn't have cell phones. So just to reach and communicate with your peers was immensely facilitated by the fact that you were in the same location. So that's why it was very critical to do that. And by this time, ASEA is operating in motors, generators, traction equipment, transmission systems, switchgear, all kinds of stuff. So it's there's already a very broad range of different product lines that need to be covered in order to give these let's say system level solutions for your customers' unique problems. And the other interesting storyline here, not just Edström's arrival in 1903, but another foundational story. Why did he come? And the story was that during the past 10, 13 years, ASEA had been expanding aggressively, but financially the business was not great, and it was increasingly exposed to competition, because everybody else also came up with the idea that electricity is the future. And then we get to a point which is also very, very fundamental for Swedish industrial capitalism, and that is Stockholm's Enskilda Bank and the Wallenberg family that comes into picture. And it's so fascinating to read the let's say the things that are discussed over those years, the governance models, the capital discipline, the selection of board of directors, long horizon strategies and planning, those are brought to the House of ASEA at the same time when the Stockholm's Enskilda Bank comes as a founder, as an investor to the company, and this is a foundational element because, of course, Wallenberg family and has continued to be in a pivotal role in Swedish industry ever since. And I mean, in our Kone episode, we were talking about Wallenbergs, and we will talk about Wallenbergs going forward as well. But this is the area where everything starts.
Yeah, and it's quite funny that effectively they're coming in very early. Oh, just remember, listeners, we talked about ASEA starting in 1883, doing this first deal with the transmission line, iron ore, hydro. And really by 1902, 1903, they're out of cash. Yeah, and really it's this Wallenberg bank, because it's the Wallenberg family that kind of own the bank, that come in with the restructuring, and they're like, founders, you're doing a great job. We need we need our guy in the office, and we need him to run it. So Edstrom very much comes with that remit, but it's so funny that effectively when you look at the impact the Wallenbergs have, they come in very early, and they have to come in to basically do a restructuring job.
And what is funny here is that, I mean, we are talking about stuff that happened 120 years ago. I mean, this whole way how capital and investors, how they are requiring certain characteristics and they have requirements for the governance, for the leadership team, for the founders, etc. I mean, the things that we discuss today are pretty much the same stuff that were already discussed 120 years ago.
Yes, very much so. So then we'll come back to the Wallenbergs, because I think you can't discuss this story without discussing them as well. But at this particular point in time, ASEA is kind of growing nicely under Edstrom's tutelage into the 1950s, and effectively it's very much focused on effectively this growing Sweden's industrial base, right? So that's its focus. But then we touched on this, Marty, the Swiss side of the house, they're not growing inside one country, they're going wide. Yeah, if ASEA is going deep, they're going wide, and they're becoming this multinational federation at this point. So let's talk about Mannheim and how this all comes to being.
Well, I mean, one of the things which is, of course, clear here, I mean, why? I have no way of saying whether they had the vision that, of course, we need to do international for this and this strategic reason. It could have been very utilitarian reasons, actually, because those days, international trade between countries was very much controlled. You had taxes, levies, and other kinds of duties between the nations, and you were very much supporting local companies. I mean, especially when we talk about government funding, it went to local national players. And there was an opportunity to start building the electricity works of Mannheim in Germany, pretty close to Frankfurt, roughly in that area. So not in the border with Switzerland directly, a little bit further away. And this started in 1898 already, when Brown Boveri wins the contract to build the electricity works. And a couple of years later, they opened a major factory in the Mannheim area with roughly 400 employees. So this was not a sales office. This was not a office for mailmen. This was a major factory that was established. And what this meant is that rather than being a Swiss company, it's already starting to have a Swiss-German identity. And what's even more interesting is that Mannheim continues to develop and is becoming more and more important over the years. So Mannheim is still today a critical part of the whole ABB ecosystem.
Yeah, and
Now,
when I was reading some of the histories on this particular period, there was a bit of a culture clash. I'm saying that kind of in air quotes for those because we don't do the visual on these podcasts. There's a bit of a culture clash between the German engineers and the basically thinking that Switzerland is just a place for tourists to go and visit and is not a
mhm,
heavy engineering culture, right? And there's this whole challenge here of the Swiss parent and the kind of German daughter, for want of a better word, in terms of company structure, but then the engineering respect running back and forth, right, between those particular issues. And I think that's that managing subsidiaries, and managing the culture of those subsidiaries, particularly if they're in different countries, is a very difficult challenge.
yeah, and that's really the case. But I mean, that's actually one of the challenges that we have in Europe. Is what you just said, is that it's so bloody difficult for us to actually genuinely work together. And once again, taking a lesson from this 100 years old story, taking a lesson to today. How many different kinds of armored vehicle manufacturers we have in Europe, and we have the very same thing. The national governments wanting to favor their national industries for various reasons, some of which are very good. But really to work together, cross border collaboration in Europe is very challenging, and there's a lot of consolidation opportunities in Europe going forward. And these guys were struggling with the same stuff 100 years ago. So
Yep.
it's unbelievable. And of course there are genuine differences. There are genuine differences in legislation. There
Mm-hmm.
are tax systems are different.
Yep.
The whole Swiss employee and employer relationships are treated very differently when you go to Germany. Already those years you had the Works Council that has a a very strong role. Germany has been in a way exemplary in having employees represented in the board of directors, and they have actual role there. So it's it's very fundamental difference with between the Swiss and the German industry, and this is where Fritz Funk is coming to the picture, because he's on the BBC side. He's essentially the one who is building the structures going forward, because the Brown Bovary in this period becomes really economically formidable through strong local industrial power, having the local industrial power in different places, and the multinational reach that they established these years. They were creating a lasting competitive edge for the Swiss side.
Yeah, and what I love about this part of the BBC years, right, is that you can feel both the source of strength and the future tension in the business at the same time, right? So BBC or Brown Bovary goes wide. It creates these subsidiary companies in Germany and elsewhere. It harnesses the engineering strength. It helps electrify systems. It's doing a great job, but also it's having to do this cross-border work, right? The reason it does subsidiaries is the tariffs that Marty talked about, or the fact that there's very little protection for foreign firms operating in a country. Yeah, or even like we saw in Roche, very difficult to get your money from country A to country B, right? So you have to kind of, if you're in a small country like Switzerland, you have to go wide. But then the problem of going wide is you set yourself up this overhead challenge, right? You set this difficulty of effectively managing wide distributors and these wide subsidiaries with all their different cultures. And so it's kind of more complicated. It can give you great economies of scale, but you have to manage those economies of scale. They don't just get to you on a silver plate.
Yeah,
And
and the and at the same time, the technological heft is everywhere. So with these very simplified, let's say, titles that we give for the company, there's a lot of actual things, actual problems, engineering challenges that need to be solved related to turbines, generators, power systems, all kinds of things. So there's a very, very strong basis of solving the hardest physical problems that are relevant for industry, and very much on the transportation that comes to picture early on. So it's a network of industrial capabilities that are being managed by this Swiss side of our story.
Yeah, and listeners, again, if you're kind of, we're not pressing the timeline too much, but in this mid 1940s, kind of coming out of World War II, these two companies are very much involved in building institutions, but these institutions also building nations, right? This is this whole concept of European nations that are coming forward in this particular point. And I do want to mention a little crossover, which I loved because we talked about it at the time and I completely forgot about it until I read it. During 1925 to 1926, Brown Boveri in Mannerheim had a certain Heikki Herlin from Kone as an employee. And I'd forgotten that when Heikki got kind of sent out of Finland for his industrial apprenticeship, and he spends time in America, and we talked about his time at Otis and his time in American companies, I'd forgotten he'd also spent a lot of time in Germany, or at least a year in Germany, learning how to manufacture.
Oh yes, that's of course a great story in itself. Now, when we're in 1949, like it's already mentioned, I think you mentioned already that it's 10,000 employees in 43 countries that have been gathered. So both of these houses, by the end of the 40s, are no longer simply promising electrical companies. They are established institutions and they have real industrial consequence.
Yeah. And I think the challenge here is we try and box these narratives so they're kind of easier for the listener to understand. It really is a period of constant challenge, constant growth, survive World War I, survive World War II. And really, as we come into these late 1940s and we go now into the 1970s in kind of Act 3, as we would call it, the challenges change, right? So once a country is substantially electrified, the next layer of difficulty is how do you run higher voltages over longer distances, right? How do you control increasingly complex industrial systems? These are systems that often layered one on top of each other. So the challenge that the companies, the two houses face when we go into the 1950s, 60s, and 70s changes shape, and they have to change with it. Yeah. And again, I think at this particular point, the strength of the BBC house, the Brown Boveri house, is it sits inside this larger, heavier, and more complex structure, but it's definitely not a simple structure. And I think ASEA at this point, as we come into the 1950s, starts to simplify or stay simple. And this is a bit like Anthropic. We just do coding, right? Whereas OpenAI is kind of going wide at this point. So let's now dive back to ASEA, Marty. What are they up to in the 1950s?
Well, I think there's one critical, let's say, protagonist that we need to mention. That is Uno Lam, who was born in the very early part of the 20th century, and he was critical in developing and patenting some innovations in the high voltage DC technology. And he accumulated altogether 150 patents or so. So we are talking about a technical innovator and somebody who studied in the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm, the Kungliga Tekniska Högskolan, how it's called in Swedish, had an engineering degree. But why this everything makes sense that in addition to ASEA completing the first 380 kilovolt AC transmission line, a couple of years later, the first commercial high voltage DC link between the mainland Sweden and the island of Gotland was established. So these both are really showing the leadership of being able to transmit a massive amount of electrical power from one place to another. And Once again, getting back to Thomas Alva Edison, who was very much in favor of the DC solution, it turns out to be that when you start putting cables underwater, the underwater cable is so bloody expensive, and putting it into place and maintaining it when somebody happens to break your cable with an accidental drop of an anchor, it's actually the DC technology is providing you with a more affordable solution. And with today's technology at around 50 kilometers underwater cable, it makes worthwhile to turn into DC technology rather than the alternating current. And the Gotland example is really the stellar example. It's an island. It's a large island, and you had to be able to solve this problem, and it's definitely more than 50 kilometers away from the mainland Sweden.
Yeah, and I love the fact that we are able to tell Lamb's story, because I don't think this guy gets enough credit, right? We talk about Edison, we talk about Tesla. Lamb has 150 patents. Right?
Mm.
Like he's a prolific inventor and clearly a generational talent. And the fact that, again, ASEA is able to attract, build, cultivate this sort of caliber individual, I think is amazing. Like there's a frame for Brown Boveri at this time as well. They're known as the Nobel Prize Company, right? Because they effectively have so many Nobel Prize winners. These are the best people in the world in terms of some of the smartest minds are solving some of this frontier technology problems. So I love the Gotland story simply because it shows this whole post-war shift. Right. So it's really a question of, can you take the cable, the distances, and manage the losses? And I love the fact that it's ASEA that almost becomes Edison's successor and bring DC power back to the grid. And obviously, we're seeing this with data centers today. Right. The challenges around effectively managing the electricity in and the electricity out of the data centers and the kind of the demands of that side. It speaks to the clever engineering that needs to go back onto that one. But I think, Marty, we need to the technology is amazing, but I think we need to go back to the financing.
So, yeah, absolutely.
Because at the moment, all of this needs paying for. So who's kind of behind the money behind it?
Yeah. And I mean, we already talked about Wallenberg with the Stockholm Enskilda Bank story, and 1956 there's another very, very well-known figure that becomes the chairman of ASEA, and that is Marcus Wallenberg Jr., who was born in Stockholm in 1899 and studied in Stockholm School of Economics and spends the early 20s around Geneva, London, New York, Paris, Berlin, learning banking the hard way, and is really getting ready to be a real contributor rather than being the son of some rich dude. So he's definitely a very, very serious banker and a subject matter expert, and that's really tying ASEA or continuing to keep ASEA very much tied to the core of Swedish capitalism, and that's and that matters because it means that through Wallenberg's, there is patient capital, there is governance models, seriousness of the overall management, the continuity and long-term vision of appointing board members, and really managing the long strategic vision of the company, rather than just having people who are there to collect meeting fees and eating Danish pastries with Swedish coffee. So this is something that we shouldn't underestimate in this whole story. And once again, the lessons learned to the future. Board positions are not there to be ways to let's say appoint your friends or your acquaintances. It's a core element of making a sustainable, long-term, successful company, and that's what Marcus Wallenberg Jr., I mean, his father was called Marcus as well, is bringing, and of course Marcus Wallenberg in especially Nordic countries is an iconic figure of Swedish capital.
And I love the dream team that we kind of assemble at Asea in this point. So if you have kind of Lamb giving its technical edge, 150 patents plus, Wallenberg gives its patient capital. Patient capital doesn't mean non-demanding capital.
No, not at all.
Patient capital just means that we're going to be here for a long time and we're going to make this great, right? And then we mentioned him on the Connie episode, but Kurt Nicklin arrives and gives it a real managerial sharpness. Now, he matters. This is not a generic executive, right? Kurt Nicklin's prestige is almost as long as a lot, some of the greatest people we've featured on this podcast, right? He's born in Stockholm in 1921. He's educated at the Royal Institute of Technology, Sweden's kind of one of the top university. He graduates in 1945. And then basically he's at ASEA as CEO from 1961. And he's kind of an engineer manager, right? So he can see and understand he's kind of like the founders from Google needed effectively the third chairman CEO who had an engineering background to kind of make some of the magic happen. And it's a little bit like that with Kirk Nicklin. So he's very much about modernizing an industrial house without severing it from its technical root. So I think he seems very good at that. And there's a stack of deals they do during this period, right, that have Nicklin's kind of fingerprints all over them in terms of moving ASEA forward as a really substantial house.
Yeah. And I mean, where are we in the 60s under Kurt Nicklin is that the ASEA side has, first of all, the serious research and technical capability, serious governance, which is very modern. I mean, if we think about today being modern, ASEA was very modern with the governance model already those years, and it has definitely a modern managerial posture, which means that they are also building the management of the company and the talent within the company with a very, very modern outlook, rather than just being driven by friends and relatives being promoted to the various positions. So this is a critical, I think, in the whole history of the company, Kurt Nicklin and his way of being in the forefront of managing industrial corporations is in a very, very pivotal point. And ASEA is working there, and the difference between ASEA and the Brown Boveri side becomes visible in these years, because both are formidable companies, but they have a very different identity that will eventually be fully understood when the merger discussions in the mid 80s around that time start.
Yeah, and again, you should have in your mind, listeners, that ASEA is sharpening. It's created this stellar team, and they are really pushing forward in the 1960s. And sadly, when you compare the other house, the team is not the same caliber, right? I'm sorry, right? We have very good people doing a very good job, but effectively it's not the A team. And they've gone wider, right? So this becomes about managing the growth, but it's feeling, and we have people like Franz Lurzbacher here, they're very credible individuals, but it feels heavy, right? It feels a multinational federation. It feels like it's managing all those tensions that we talked about earlier. It doesn't feel like a juggernaut plowing through. It feels like it's taking this wider stance and it's moving slower, and it's managing with lower margins, and it's struggling to basically achieve its kind of velocity, whereas ASEA has put its foot on the gas and is moving a lot faster.
Yeah, absolutely. And Franz Luthebacher, when he comes, he's not even an engineer. I mean, there's clearly a change that somebody without engineering background, I mean, Franz comes from law and administration, is really in the point of seeing once again that this company, Brown Boveri, has become big enough that once again the governance model needs to be reinvented and reshaped. And the I mean, you could even say that this is not a commercial or technical. I mean, in many cases, we talk about companies that you have either technical or commercial challenges, and trying to merge those together is the challenge. But here we are talking about, actually, you could even say, the constitutional challenge. How do you govern something this large, this layered, this multinational, with strong inherited centers of gravity? Because by this time, the Maschinenfabrik Oerlikon had been merged with the Brown Boveri Corporation, and that's where Lutherbacher comes in, and he starts solving this issue. And it is clear that Brown Boveri has become quite large, quite conservative, quite rigid. Mm-hmm. Many of those attributes that we even today may connect with the Swiss tradition. So this is a very quintessential Swiss engineering company.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point, right? ASEA looks like an operating system at this point. It has research, it has governance, it has management, it has product direction, and they're all reinforcing one another. And it's becoming more precise on the categories it's playing in, its strengths, it's more pointed, it's harder, right? And it's solving those problems. It knows what it's doing, and it's doing it well. And at the moment, we're recording this episode in, July 2026. It's feeling more anthropic, right? It's feeling like it knows what it's doing. It's going to make some mistakes, but it's driving forward and it's getting faster every day. And OpenAI at this point, or Brown Boveri, is feeling like that, which is it's going in 10 different directions. Some of this will come off, some of it won't. It also feels like it doesn't have the patient capital behind it to kind of move it forward. And it's feeling like it's kind of almost getting a little bit left on the wayside as ASEA kind of steps on the gas. And Marty, there's some really important dates here coming up that kind of show that we're kind of really moving forward.
Yeah. And I mean, we already mentioned the 380 kilovolt transmission line and the high voltage DC Gotland link, Marcus Wallenberg, Kurt Nicolin. We mentioned all these, and when we get to the early 70s, both these houses are clearly great companies, and there's not a way, and there's no need even to say which one is better, which one is the winner compared to somebody else. That's not important. The key element, which is playing the story toward the merger that happened a bit more than 10 years later from this point, is that ASEA is very, very formidable through research, sharp management, strong governance model, for world-class answers to system-level electrical problems. And the Brown Boveri side is formidable through industrial breadth, multinational operations, serious heavy electrical capability, and the accumulated mass of a very large industrial company.
So we're now into what we call Act 4, so we're into the 70s. And in this period, the tide has changed. Because for nearly a century, electricity has been this rising force, right? Don't get me wrong, there's lots of technical problems to solve. And the houses have had to solve those problems as they go. But by the mid-1970s, that easy wind is no longer blowing. We have the oil shocks. We have the embargoes. A lot happens in the 70s.
Oh, absolutely.
A lot happens in the 70s. And again, a good example here. So consumption of electricity has been growing at 7% a year up to 1973 and 1974. And at that point, 1974, it drops to 4%. Right. And then pretty much we get this kind of almost lost decade where effectively electricity kind of diminishes and fades into the background. Right. So if ASEA had been surging forward previously, going into the 1970s, into the early 1980s, it's going to have to find another gear because the market conditions are now a lot tougher. And the margins are going to basically disappearing. And people are trying to exit this power business, exit electricity because it's too capital intensive. It's too difficult. So somebody else needs to come in. Kurt Nicolin's done an amazing job, but somebody else needs to come into ASEA to basically find another gear for these guys.
Yeah. And we get to the next protagonist of our story. Somebody who has been many times quoted as being the let's say on top 3 or even the number 1 industrial leader figure of Sweden, of Europe, and a very modern leader. By the time he was active, he was actually very modern with his leadership style. And of course, we are talking about Percy Barnevik, who was born in 1941 in Simrishamn and grows up in Uddevalla, which is a small town on the west coast of Sweden. And this is industrial Sweden. And what is interesting is that Barnevik's parents had a printing business, and that was very labor intensive and very time critical. Everything that they did was very time critical. And it had a fundamental influence on Persy, who eventually, one of the things that he did later in his career was that he actually collected a huge collection of books. So he continued to love books until the very end of his life. Well, he was studying business, economics and law, spent some time in Stanford, and then built his reputation first working for Datema and then very quickly going to Sandvik, a machinery business essentially. And what is interesting is that he actually stayed as the chairman of the board in Sandvik until the very end of his professional career as an industry leader. So definitely a very, very strong career there. But already at the age of 39, he joins ASEA, and the year when that happened was 1979. And he was clearly a fast climber in the Swedish industrial ecosystem. This is a stellar speed, and what he achieved at a very young age. And what happened in Sandvik, which was partly due to his vision, but also at the same time, it was interesting, is that at this time, software industry was growing very rapidly. You started how to have enterprise systems and other software solutions that were increasingly becoming available in the 70s. And already, at the time when he was in Sandvik, he saw the opportunity with data. The Sandvik was a company building machinery essentially, low margins, but the stakes very high. And he essentially built a model where he was very focused on using data and various graphs of describing where you are and then taking very rapid actions to correct any deviations from the expected level. And Sandvik was clear. The same template that was used in Sandvik, it was also used when later on they acquired Strömberg, a Finnish firm, and before we ended up being in the ABB merger, Sandvik and Strömberg were really the companies where a lot of the integration model and the cross-border integration challenges were already tested. And I mean, it's like Sandvik. This is not a story about Sandvik, but just a side note. The Finnish Tamrock, who was building underground technologies for drilling, excavation, that ended up being acquired by Sandvik, like Strömberg was acquired by. It's an interesting things, and what amazes me here is how modern Barnevik, with his management style, was very early on. So he was, in a way, I mean, you could say that he was 20 years ahead of most of the industrial companies in Europe in the way how he prioritized the way how companies should be run. Absolutely, the time in Stanford has learned him the American way, so that had a strong influence on his thing. But that's really amazing how, I mean, like he's been compared with Jack Welch. He's very determined, very visionary, and even you could say ruthless in the execution side on when he wants to make changes happen, and still do that in a humanly respectful way. So this is a great story, and when it comes to ASEA, he's arriving at the very, very right moment to ASEA, because the growth has kind of died. The growth was very slow this time, and the original electrical tailwind has already waned, and the management quality started to matter more. So as a great timing exercise, Barnevik comes to ASEA.
Yeah, and again, I think there's a good example here. Barnevik is exactly the sort of manager that the Wallenbergs love, right? When he comes into to ASEA, he's had his time in Sandvik, so he's worked in the steel industry, which is a very national, low margin, high risk industry. He's coming with a kind of software engineer background. Right? Like he's a data consultant. That's like going into a business and working out the software side. He's relatively low ego at this stage at 39. Like he's he's a rising star, but fairly unknown. And he's got dirt under his fingernails, right? Like his family comes from a printing business where like he's growing up in not, rich Stockholm. He's growing up in West Coast industrial Sweden. Right? He's got grit. There's no question about it. And he arrives in 1980. He's fresh off the back of his success with Sandvik. And he's definitely a man on a hurry. And he's obsessed, and I'm using that word quite deliberately, he's obsessed with a number of things. First of all, get close to the customer. Right? Literally, everything in ASEA at this point gets turned into a profit center. You're either selling your services internally or externally, or you're out. Right? Secondly, you need to reduce the head office, and you really need to basically slim it down, automate everything that you can. Don't carry the bureaucracy if you're operating in a low margin business. And remember, he's come from steel. Steel is low margin. And thirdly, you need to know your numbers, right? If you're going to operate fast, if you're going to course correct as you go, you need to know your numbers. You need an operating system. And at this point in time, he's a software engineer data guy. You can build an operating system. So he literally sets off at a sprint. So he takes ASEA's head office numbers from over 2,000 when he arrives. Within a couple of years, it's 150 people working in the head office, right? He flattens that, right? And then I love this story, Marty. I don't know if you saw this in your research of these Percy's boys, although one of them's a woman. So it's forgive everybody, it's the 1980s. Sexism was kind of like, kind of default. And they formed this President's Investigation Group, or PIG, not a great acronym. And they're just really highly analytical ASEA managers. And he just talent picks them from a bunch of different functions. And this is almost creating a software system before you have the software system. Go and find sharp people who've got great managerial talent, high agency, take them across the business and look at what can we do to basically get the margins back, get the growth back, improve productivity, right? And kind of unleash a huge amount of energy and a huge amount of direction into this business before it completely stalls. So I love this story.
Yeah, I wish to add another view to that thing. The Perseus Boys was not actually invented to be just the investigation group. I mean, there was another motivation, and the motivation was really to give young, promising people an opportunity to show what they can do. Because the key was that how do you find in a large organization, how do you find the people who are able and willing to take more responsibility going forward? So there was a talent development dimension to that. And yes, it was used for the President's Investigation Group as a utilitarian tool. But at that time, a very, very novel approach to get performance out of an organization. And Jack Welch was already mentioned because it's very comparable when Jack Welch was the CEO for 20 years, starting in 1981 at GE. And at that time, the stock price of GE rose around 30x. And Percy was the CEO of ASEA and later ABB for a total of 16 years. And the stock price increased by 87x. So, not saying which one is better, but very, very comparable. And of course, the guys knew each other. I mean, of course, you knew each other because you were dealing electrical engineering in two different domains, but definitely knew each other, and that's really the management style is in many cases has similar elements. But when I studied, for example, the autobiography of Persy, it's still I think there was a still more humane element. I mean, he was definitely of the opinion that if you need to fire a manager, a CEO, or managing director, or whoever, you need to do that earlier rather than later. So he was very, very ruthless and in taking corrective action whenever needed. But at the same time, I think his thoughts on leadership and how to foster better performance amongst the uh, the the young rising talents, it was very, very modern and very human after all. And when you talk about the sexism here, actually Persson was of the opinion that he doesn't really care if somebody is a man or a woman. All he cares is that what they can do. And whenever there are women who are able to perform, he's more than happy to give them an opportunity. And so, in a way, he was quite modern there as well.
Yeah, and
So
again, I
anyway,
think just on that one, I think it's very important in terms of Percy is comparable to Jack Welch in terms of his what he achieves and what he doesn't achieve, right? But I think also it's very interesting to look at what happens to Percy after ASEA, right? And I'm sure we'll come to that later. Like, how does he spend his time after he leaves the business, right? As opposed to how does Jack spend his time after he leaves the business? There's no question if you'd swap them, right? So if you'd put Percy in GE and you'd put Jack in ASEA, a lot of the stuff would have been happened the same, right? They were very much cut from the same cloth. But there's an interesting thing there. Would Percy have done as much of the kind of financial engineering as Jack ended up doing in GE in terms of the financial growth, the financial services side? And would Percy have played those cards in the same way? Would Jack have played different cards in terms of the ASEA merger? But it's definitely
yeah,
comparable records, and they're definitely both titans of their era and very much ahead of the time, right? In terms of the action that they took and the ambition level that they had for their companies. That's definitely comparable.
yeah, and but those days when Persson became the CEO of ASEA, it's the whole European electrical industry was very crowded. I mean, we had around 20 national competitors. There was a lot of overcapacity in the marketplace. The costs were high, and the cross-border trade was very limited, and pretty much half the companies were losing money. So that was definitely an opportunity for consolidation. And even ASEA in those days, it only about half of sales came outside of Sweden. So even if we are already now in the 80s, ASEA is very domestically oriented company actually. And this whole thing is making one interesting step is that in 1986 ASEA acquires Stromberg and gets an additional 7,000 employees to the organization. And of course, Stromberg is a very well-known company also from our Kone episode, because the company was established by Gottfried Stromberg, and they were involved with elevator business or lift business, whichever way you want to say that. And this merger or acquisition and how to handle a cross-border integration of a company, essentially integrating national champions. I mean, Stromberg was not just any other company. It was like ASEA of Finland, involved with all kinds of activities, and something that the Finland and the Finnish industry and Finnish politicians were very proud of. So not an easy case, but the way how it was handled and the way how ASEA eventually pulled that through and how Barnevik was able to do that, it became a benchmark exercise that is helped ASEA and Barnevik going forward. Now, what is of course an interesting thing is that, and you can see, you can read this very clearly from the autobiography, is that Perssi was very, very much appreciating Finland, the Finnish skills and technologies and the capability, and the for example, the frequency converters that were essential for controlling the motors, these AC motors, that technology has been and continues to be in the core of ABB capabilities even today. And what is interesting here is that in addition to the technological synergies that have been successfully implemented here, the thing is that it's really the integration of the people, and this is why I like Pärsy in a way more than the public image of Jack Welch, is that I think the way how the merger of Stromberg was done, it shows the human side and the human the appreciation of the human beings who are behind the technology. The appreciation in Barnevik's way of doing the merger is clearly visible. So this was not a ruthless merger. It was a merger that aimed to build something better. 1 + 1 can be more than 2.
Yeah. So, and again, listeners, Marty and I do a lot of research for each of these episodes. And obviously we read the biographies of the individuals, Percy, etc. But what we also try and do is we talk to the people who knew them. Percy sadly passed on in 2025, but we talk to the people who knew them and we talk to people who worked with them. And what comes out from Percy's conversations with those who knew him was this is a guy who's very much a software engineer. If you want a modern parallel, he's kind of Reed Hastings, right? Right? He's very logical. He's very, very intellectual. But also he's a very good communicator, right? And he's very funny, right? He tells a lot of jokes, right? There's a lot of kind of humor in what he does. And when he's appreciating Stromberg as a potential opportunity, he's appreciating it at multiple levels. He's appreciating the technical competence that Stromberg is thinking. He's seeing the political sensitivity of, as Marty said, the Swedish national champion acquiring the Finnish national champion. Now, if you don't know anything about Sweden and Finland, just appreciate that they have some history and there's some sensitivity to effectively the Swedish company acquiring the Finnish company. And again, I think what they do here, which is super smart, and whether this phrase comes out at the time or whether it comes out later, is they sell a new mission to Stromberg, right? So they're saying it's like better to be the king of AC drives than to be a peasant in generators and transformers. I'm not sure if those were the actual words used, but I love the phrase that they basically look, Stromberg, you're doing a lot, but you're not winning outside your core market. If we get together and you specialize on the thing that you're brilliant at, and you add your scale to our scale, we can expand what we do, right? So it's not a question of Stromberg's world gets smaller, Stromberg's world gets narrower, but it actually ends up becoming better at what it does. And when Percy, and again, see this in the team, it's not just Percy, I know we're using him as shortcut, see this in the management team. When they bid for Stromberg, 1986, they prepare the ground very carefully. Remember, Percy's been in the company like 5-6 years at this point, right? So one of the things he does, and I love this story, is he hires a helicopter on Midsummer's Eve because he needs to have a face-to-face meeting. He could do a call, but he needs to have a face-to-face meeting with the Finnish Ministry of Industry. And the only way he can reach this guy, now Midsummer's Eve is a big thing in the Nordics, is he hires a helicopter so he can fly to the east of Finland, land his helicopter next to this guy's summer cottage, meet with him face to face, and make sure that he's on board with this deal because he doesn't want the problems later to play out in the press. So this is the classic get on the plane, yeah, have the meeting. You could do it over a call, you could make your life much easier, you could send him a letter, etc. There's no email. But in this case, it's go the extra mile, get on the plane, or in this case, the helicopter, go to the guy's place and make sure that effectively you've turned over every single stone before the deal gets announced. And I think it's that level of detail, intent, logic, charisma, persona, whatever, that just comes through this whole period in spades.
Yeah. And I mean, there was also another figure that was very critical, and that was the permanent secretary of Ministry of Trade and Industry, Bunta Wahlroos, who was in that position for many, many, many years. And if he would have been strongly against this merger, it would have died away. because Buntavarus was a very, very powerful figure. Even if he was not a politician, he was the highest ranking civil servant in the Ministry of Trade and Industry, like it was called in those days. Well, I mean, it's just open and honest, and I mean,
yeah.
Him, for among others. I mean, the story that you already outlined very well. It's. Do you want to be? Do you want to be a big fish in a small pond, or do you want to be a medium-sized fish in a much larger body of water? And I mean, it makes sense.
Yeah.
It makes sense.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
when you explained, I mean, if when we think about strategies, and of course strategies at the detail level, they have a lot of details, but the best strategies are still the one where the core narrative can be very easily and understandably explained, and the details come later. If your narrative is complex because there are so many details and you don't see the core message in your strategy, then it's just so much more difficult to communicate. Be that your customers, your stakeholders, your political stakeholders, or your own people, or your investors. So trying to have a strategy that is easy to explain, the classic elevator pitch, that makes sense. And for Buntavarus, it's clear that the storyline, the why merge, it made sense. I think it's as simple as that. And of course, now when we get to the mid 80s, to the years just before the merger discussion started with between ASEA and Brown Boveri, it's we will reach a point where ASEA has 71,000 employees, Brown Boveri has 97,000 people. I mean, we are talking about humongous organizations. ASEA had 6.8 billion in revenues and 370 million of after-tax profit. So not bad figures. Brown Boveri had, even if they were roughly 25% large, they had 8.5 billion in revenues and only 1/3, 132 million of after-tax profit. So the stories here, I mean, broadly speaking, same order of magnitude companies, but ASEA, thanks to the different governance model, is producing almost 3 times the after-tax profit, and this is then going to be will be influencing the discussions when the merger talks start a little bit later in the storyline.
Yeah, and it's pretty brutal, and it's not just that ASEA has put the foot on the accelerator. When you look at the key figures for the 4 competitors, 1975 to this kind of mid 1980s period, and you look at the order intake, like how much are they adding? BBC, but Brown Boveri is up 14. ASEA is up 350 extra orders. The turnover from Brown Boveri is increases by 45. For ASEA, it's 359. Right? The turnover per person in Brown Boveri increases by a factor of 48. On their side, for ASEA, it's 229. But again, Siemens has put its foot on the gas. General Electric puts on its foot on the gas. Like everybody else is doing, ASEA is the market leader with 350x multiples on everything it's doing. Siemens is 150s, GE's is in 200s, and Brown Boveri is languishing in last place with single-digit growth. Like it's bad for Brown Boveri at this stage. They're in a very uncomfortable position. They are large and they are not moving quickly at all.
Yeah, that's clear. There's one episode that before we get to the merger story, there was an important 63% stake that ASEA bought from Norway, and the company was Elektrisk Bureau, EB for short.
Yep.
Why this is significant is that it was yet another Nordic cross-border merger where the tools how to do those things and how to integrate the people so that the outcome is better. It's not a hostile takeover where somebody's trying to only focus power. It's trying to build something larger and something more performing than the companies alone would be. So that's one element to remember there.
Yeah, and again, if you're following the storyline, where we've got to as we come into this kind of pre-merger now conversation, Asea is kind of put its foot on the gas, got itself very, very organized, got a great management team, and has become a Nordic company rather than just a Swedish company. And with Brown Boveri, they're kind of not quite in a world of pain, but they are definitely feeling the strain. And Mannerheim is also causing a lot of problems because by 1983, Mannerheim accounts for nearly half of the revenue for Brown Boveri as a company. So the one subsidiary is 50% of the business, right? And that's making it difficult because they're having this higher overhead. They have multiple subsidiaries across Europe, right? They feel like they're large, but they also feel like they're very heavy, right? And at this point, I think, it's if Percy's the kind of, it takes two to tango, as we're going to see in the merger. Percy needs like somebody on the other side who's going to help make this happen. So now we need to introduce the next character, Marty.
Well, I mean, that's Fritz Lothweiler, a guy who was born in the early 1920s, studied economics in the University of Zurich, works in London, career in Swiss National Bank, and all these, let's say, very traditional Swiss official corporate financial seriousness that you have. I mean, essentially a core figure in a Swiss industrial establishment, and he becomes the chairman in the mid 80s. I mean, he was first the president of Brown Boveri for 10 years, and then becomes a president in 85. And he is essentially sees it clearly that okay, now this is not working. You need to do something better. And the Brown Boveri has become you could even say, a bloated organization at this time. It's absolutely a great industrial entity in Europe, but clearly something needs to be done to manage and lead this organization more efficiently where they are at the moment. And I mean, just a comment of that was found from somewhere there is that Brown Boveri makes 10% too little turnover, has 10% too many people. So I mean, not a massive discrepancy, but clearly something that the actions need to be taken.
Yeah, and I think it's Fritz's first comment that you just read out on the company is like, it's a kind of it's too little turnover, too many people. That really is kind of, being very, very polite Swiss, but very direct in terms of what the problem was, right? And again, I think this is where we get into these kind of merger conditions because Percy, and let's be clear, we're using Percy as the caricature, but Percy's looking at the market and realized that none of these companies, these national champions, like in steel, none of them are making any money, right? And everybody's protecting their own business. Every country's protecting its own business, and the tide's gone out, and no one's wearing any bathing wear. A lot of these companies not making money. So what he's trying to do is now, okay, I'm going to basically acquire the Nordic set, so Stromberg and Norway. He's going to bring them together. He's going to remission them so that they're focused, and he's going to go forward. So if this logic holds that the Nordics can be combined, and remember that his big competitors are kind of GE and Siemens and Hitachi at this point, then he's looking outside and going, well, the logic still holds, right? I need to build a European scale business at this stage to compete with the might of America, with the might of Japan. So they go looking basically for another business to combine with. And effectively, and I genuinely believe this, without Fritz on the other side of this table, this conversation would have stopped before it even started. Like, I think it's Fritz's pragmatism and calm logic, and also his understanding that effectively he can't turn around Brown Boveri in the way that Asea has been accelerated. He doesn't have that talent pool, I don't think, on which to draw, and he doesn't have that ambition level. He needs them. So, Asea looking at Brown Boveri is going, we need industrial scale, we need might, and we need breadth. And Brown Bovary is looking at us saying, like, we need like the commando team to kind of come in and do what we're not prepared to do for ourselves and deal with Mannerheim and deal with our overhead problems. And then maybe together we can go places. And I think that's the kind of framing for where they look at each other and realize that there's a potential deal here.
Yeah, and I mean the other way to see that is that yes, this is a category leaders podcast. We are talking about companies that are born in Europe and they have become leaders of their respective categories globally. So both on Fritz's side and Perss's side, they essentially saw that, I mean, the competition is not here. I mean, this is not a European closed market. This is a global market, and the competitors are actually in United States and in Southeast Asia. And well, even if we didn't, I mean, China was already taking remarkable steps in those years. It was not necessarily that obvious. But the thing is that that if we are just in this little European sandbox, if we are just fighting with each other, we are missing the global picture altogether. And it was clearly that you need to do something, because just standing still doesn't mean that you maintain your global position. And we had, I mean, clearly we had, luckily, both of these companies, we had a person in the leadership that were both representing an unstoppable force in their respective sandboxes, and as a result, something new was definitely possible.
Yeah, so listeners, if you want to go into more detail on the merger, and Marty and I are going to kind of give you a kind of a headline level approach, I would strongly recommend to read ABB, The Dancing Giant, which came out in the late 1990s. This is a book that we both read prior to this episode. It covers the information in a lot more detail, because this is arguably one of the most impressive mergers in European history, certainly in the last kind of 30 plus years. So do read the book. So the talks kick off in July 1987. But just before that, Beat Hess, who's the head of the legal department for Brown Bovary, he's about to take his family holiday, right? He's off to Italy. You know, the summer is coming, and he gets literally the knock on the door from Fritz, and he's told to prepare a full draft agreement for the merger with ASEA, right? He's told very nicely, oh, you still take your family holiday, but make sure it's on my desk when it gets back from your family holiday. So Beat explains that there's no laptops in these days, right? We're in 1987. So he's in holiday in Italy. His kids are in the pool. They're having a lovely time. He's stuck in the hotel, basically writing, you know, suntan lotion, espresso in one hand, writing basically the merger document for the week. His family have a lovely time. He gets back and puts this suntan coffee stained document on the desk of Fritz and the chief executive, Thomas. And that's really the start of this process.
Yeah. And then they carried on and had some discussion and even came up some headlines on the subject of mutual areas of cooperation. But everybody knew that, okay, I mean, this is not going to lead into anything. Rather than trying to make a detailed agreement with reps and warranties, etc. I mean, we need to move much quickly here, and that gets to the actual beginning of meetings in July 87. Do you want to say something about that?
Yeah. So look, and I think there's a really very important lesson here right from the beginning. So secrecy is paramount in these merger discussions. We're talking about the Nordic champion and effectively the Swiss-German champion merging, right? So these companies have to be very importantly managed. So they select very small teams. So Brown Bovary has 4 people on their negotiation team. ASEA has 5 people on their team. These are big companies, but these are very small people who know about the merger. The managers are not allowed to book their flights. Like, so the Brown Bovary guys agreed to come to Stockholm in July. Stockholm in July is a holiday town. Like, the businesses have stopped. Everybody's gone off to the coast. It's a bit warm. So effectively, it's just them and the tourists. They're not allowed to book their flights through the normal flight booking process because that would tip people off that something was happening. So they have to go off and buy their own tickets. And effectively, they meet in the ASEA office because there's nobody there, right? Now, ASEA has done a bit of prep work, right? So, Brown Bovary set, poor old Beat Hess off to Italy for his holiday to do theirs. ASEA basically gets a couple of Americans, top lawyers, right, to write 100-page long document. Okay. But after they've sat down for like 20 minutes, like the Beat Hess takes his legal counterpart from ASEA to one side and went, this is not an American conversation. This 100-page document that you've put on the table is full of warranties and kind of, counterclaims. And he's like, we're getting married. Like, does it really matter who I slept with, who I had a relationship with in the past? Like, due diligence will just kill this deal if you go forward with this. There's no warranty to hold because we're basically married. We become one entity. So what's interesting at this point, very decisively, they kick out the Americans. Sorry, American lawyers. I'm sure you got paid well, right? And basically they sit down, and over the course of 2 days, they take 100+ page document from the Americans and the suntan document from Beat, and they combine them together into a very simple 15-page document, right? And the section on warranties, which is a bulk of the American text, basically says there are no warranties. Yeah.
And I mean,
there is none, right? They take 100 pages and take it down into there is nothing.
Yeah, and I mean, it's so nice. I mean, everybody who's been dealing with American agreements, it's really the representations and warranties are the part of the agreement that is full of essentially all kinds of escape routes, where people are trying to convince that, yes, we are operating in good faith, and yes, we are disclosing everything that is essential. So it's so American way. But then this whole thing ends up that then, yes, they came up with a 15-page document. There were a number of things that they still didn't agree. And then the next meeting is happening in Zurich airport. And Persu comes and sits in the end of the table and takes the 15-page document. You have the Swiss and the Swede on the side of the table. And then he takes page 1 and starts reading through the document and asks people who are around the table to comment if they have something to say. If they don't agree with something, everybody who has something to say will raise voice and will say something, and we will decide immediately what is the issue. And if you have something to say, rather than just complaining that this is all wicked and bad, what is your proposal? And it's not a proposal based on a concept or a large ideological element. What is your proposal for the actual language to be included in these 15 pages? And say it now. How about saying it right now? And then the lawyers on both sides of the table and the other people who are attending, they need to revise the text of the 15 pages document right there, right now. And rather than Persu being a distant CEO somewhere where people need to call in order to get a clearance whether this wording is good, he was there in the end of the table reading every sentence line by line. I mean, isn't that's really very different from the more hierarchical and administrative Swiss way of running these things. And this,
there's no question that, and you can hear this in the accounts from the time, they are shocked and impressed.
Yeah.
Right? This is Percy coming in and saying, I am the CEO. This is how a CEO acts. I am into the detail. We make quick decisions. We are bipartisan. This is not about what's best for Sweden and what's best for Switzerland. This is about what's best for the new entity. I am the CEO. This is me doing the job of the CEO of the new entity, right? And we're just going to I don't care where you've come from. I care what you can do, right? And I care about matters. And it's really, really like Brown Bovary guys are kind of like, this is like a head blown moment because there's nothing that they've had in the last 25 years. They've had good people, but they've never had this.
And surprise, surprise, by late that night, the same day, the whole paper was decided and agreed. So, in addition of being unorthodox, it was very, very effective. They came up with one paper.
Yeah, and just for listeners, we're brushing over a lot of complexity, but effectively what they decide to do for legal and tax reasons is rather than it's a full merger of the two public entities, they effectively create a joint venture where both entities own 50% of that joint venture. Now they have to basically move around with some of this because at this point, ASEA is way more valuable than Brown Boveri. So a kind of very nice, hey, you 50%, you 50% isn't actually very fair. So it's agreed that BBC will raise 300 million from shareholders, that ASEA actually ends up keeping some assets out of the deal. There's a hydro plant in Sweden. There is stock that they own in other Swedish companies. This was a big Wallenberg strategy that you all own stock in different entities within the Wallenberg portfolio. Some of that gets kept out of the kind of the detail, but it's really a joint venture and they are all in. This is a Catholic marriage. They are condemned to work. This has to work. There is no plan B for this on this particular side. And I think what's really interesting here, Marty, is that the tone is set right from the start of these discussions, this second meeting in Zurich. And again, it's, are people acting as new colleagues or are people acting as kind of frenemies or enemies of the past? And there's some really good examples of here where individuals, particularly on the Brown Boveri side, try to kind of keep different business units out of the merger. Yeah, for various reasons. But what was interesting is the individuals that tried to act in the interest of their parent company, their current employer, they didn't make the cut. They don't go into the new entity. When the whole thing settles down, a lot of those individuals who didn't take the attitude of future colleagues, they don't make it in.
Yeah, and this is part of the, when I was earlier referring to the human side of Percy. This I think this is a sign where actually this is not just somebody running a process with a ruthless, brutal force. It's something where you are all the time, you are assessing who are the people who are ready to be part of a solution, who are just having difficulties in letting go some of the earlier priorities that they used to have. This is where you are building something absolutely new. And what is also interesting is that this Persy's ability to move fast, having a quick solution, which is maybe approximate rather than aim for precision, that brings inherent slowness. The quick due diligence focusing on the key elements is acting and is creating the blueprint also for future mergers. And like we will later on hear, the lacking due diligence or streamlined due diligence is then, of course, there will be some skeletons that will be later on found. But to build such a major conglomerate with, we are now approaching around 180,000 people altogether in the merged company. It's very difficult to do that if you are aiming to get full control on all the little details of the transaction. I mean, it just ain't doable.
No, and certainly of entities of this particular size and scale, right? Again, I think they're all very clear. Due diligence would have killed this deal, right? It would have taken them years to really understand each other. You would have gone back and forth. So they basically decide, we're going to get married. We are in love. Even if it's love for the kind of greater market, we're in love, we're going to get married. And what's fascinating, and I'd never heard of this, is that the top management on both sides felt the merger to be so politically sensitive that all the merger documents actually get locked away in a classic Swiss bank account, Swiss bank vault for 20 years. Right. So when the merger is actually completed, all the stuff gets filed in a Swiss bank account and then gets released in 2007. Now, obviously, and it was politically sensitive, but I think because they handled it very well, no real skeletons come out at that point, right?
Yeah.
And 20 years later, it's not really controversial. There are other controversies at that time in 2007, but this isn't one of them. So again, I think there's some really interesting things they have to determine. They decide that the headquarters is going to Zurich, right? And again, Swiss national champion, Nordic national champion, or at least Swedish national champion merging together. So again, there's real concerns that effectively the headquarters are going to be here, and that will Sweden lose less influence? Now, it's also pretty obvious who's going to be the CEO of this new entity. Right?
Absolutely.
At this particular point. And that also works well. Like Fritz is the natural chairman, and they end up with a co-chairman structure. But Fritz is the natural chairman, but the natural CEO is Percy at this stage. So on the 4th of August in 1987, final merger agreement was signed at the Four Seasons Hotel in Hamburg. Now, just to be clear, listeners, this has all been done by these tiny little teams, right? The boards of their respective companies know nothing at this point, right? So they basically have to schedule extraordinary board meetings in the morning to basically brief the boards. Oh, by the way, item 2 is, we're merging with the other biggest company in Europe, right? They have to basically spend time with their boards selling this particular deal, right? And then they did this beforehand, but they need to obviously get the Wallenbergs and the concentrated ownership to basically be okay with the deal, right? And and again, we haven't explained this bit, but this is very important. They do all the negotiation in English, right? That Sweden / Nordic, Finland, Swiss, German, everything's done in English, right? And they also agree that the corporate language of the company would be English or bad English, as a lot of them say in their kind of joke, right? The first language of ABB from going forward will be bad English. But fundamentally, they have to get the boards on board, and then they basically do this massive, great big press release. Sorry, massive, great big press conference, and nobody turns up.
Yeah. And just to remember the magnitude of the story, we talk about a company that is 50% bigger than GE or Hitachi or Siemens.
Yeah.
So I mean, we are talking about a massive powerhouse of electrical engineering, and the most of the journalists, they didn't show up because they received the announcement. Okay, there's going to be a press conference, and as there had been very little happening in the industry during the past 40 years, people probably thought that, okay, it's going to be an announcement of yet another plant established somewhere in Norway or uninteresting place. And then those few that didn't have anything else to do and were attending, they were pretty much shocked that one of the Sweden's national institution was merging with one of Switzerland's national institution, and it's in addition of surprising, of course, all the journalists, it absolutely stunned all the competitors, and the speed, the agility of the negotiating teams were in a core role of making this such a surprise that nobody was able to expect it. And why this is so important is that if the little tidbits of information about something like this brewing would have been leaking to the publicity, there would have been so many different ways how the competitors could have jeopardized the whole process. I mean, just as an example, if we have Siemens from Germany, or we have Schneider, those companies that are European competitors, if they would be putting, for example, the German labor unions into defensive, the whole thing would have stalled for a long period of time, and maybe even be cancelled due to the difficulties in getting the necessary ownership from the key stakeholders.
Yeah, and look, I think you mentioned the competitors bit, and there's a lovely story about Percy doing this kind of courtesy call to the CEO of Siemens, Dr. Kalsk, and who's on vacation in Greece, right? So he reaches him via like his personal assistant, and he tells them, "Hey, oh by the way, we've just merged with Brown Boveri." And then like this stunned silence at the other end of the phone.
Yeah.
Like the guy, this is like, and first he's like, "Are you there? Did we get cut
Yeah.
off?" Right? So again, listeners, just appreciate almost the magnitude of what's happened. Literally a 9-person negotiation team from both sides has pulled together a merger of hundreds of thousands of employees. They've then informed the boards and got their consent and the owners. And now they've told the world. Firstly, the world didn't listen, but it listened pretty quickly. And then suddenly, there's hundreds of thousands of people that need to know about this, right? And there's hundreds of thousands of people who need to know, is my factory closing? Are we being merged? Who's my boss? There's a lot to now do. So again, Percy in his kind of various writings describes this as a 2-stage rocket. So first of all, they need to do restructuring very fast, right? They need to know, is the factory closing? Is it not? Right? Who are you reporting to? Who are you not? And then they need to grow, right? Because the whole point of doing this exercise wasn't just to take two things, put them together and move at the same pace. They had to basically do that. Now, there's a bet behind this, right? And there's a bet behind this is that they're going to swim against the stream. They're going to stay with the electrico-technical industry. Lots of other people are getting out of it. And they're going to prepare for the upturn in the power equipment market, and they're going to really focus on profitable niches, right, and staying in a low oxygen environment. So they're going to enter contracts with low margin, but stay there indefinitely. That's not an easy sell, right? This is we're going to merge so that we've got a better positioning, and then we're going to wait for the market to turn in our favor. And the only way we can do this is basically decentralize and centralize at the same time.
Mm. And I mean the other thing, I mean there was an interview done by Wall Street Journal where Barnevik said that if the companies would have remained isolated, they would have allowed themselves to be bought or shut down. So there was I mean they didn't necessarily use the burning platform metaphor those days, but the idea that you cannot continue like this. And once again, I think it resembles so much of two other mergers, and the one is EADS, that where the negotiations started eventually around 10 years later, first with Aerospatiale and Matra merging together, and then when the French merging with the German assets in particular. And I was following that merger very closely, and Patrice Hummel, who was one of the negotiators of that whole arrangement, he very clearly said that everybody knew that this cross-border merger between the French and the German defense assets, it was a mission impossible. It couldn't be done, but it still had to be done. So they went to that also all in very, very politically sensitive constellation. And this is exactly the same situation. And when we come to today, I genuinely feel that there's a lot of same kind of commitment to build something bigger and something more powerful. There is a genuine need to do that also today, when we are realigning our European national security and trying to consolidate the industry and try to be competitive in the world market with the capabilities we have.
Yeah, and there's no question here, and it sounds very modern as well. If you don't get Germany on board, this isn't going to work. So one of Percy's first jobs, or the first jobs of this new combined management team, is they have to basically get Germany involved with the new strategy. So a lot of time and energy gets focused on getting Germany to buy into the new scenario, where they can see growth, where they can see opportunity, where they, a bit like Stromberg, they can be sold a new mission, right? And again, I think there's shadows, and we talked about this earlier, basically of the Sandvik of the 1980s, basically stripping back the head office, putting in a matrix organization, turning everything into a profit center, making it customer focused, energizing the kind of entrepreneurs inside this company to step forward and deliver against a technological leadership type agenda. So what he did in Sandvik, what they did in ASEA, what they did in Stromberg, what they did in the Norwegian opportunity, the same thing happens now, but a much bigger scale.
Yeah, and I mean the other thing which is very important to remember that due to the changes in the, for example, if we talk about power generation, you want to build a new power plant. Due to the various requirements that have become more complex, just to build a modern power plant using any of the advanced technologies, regardless of what is the source of the energy, it's going to be 5 to 7 times more expensive than the previous generation. And if you want to be a system supplier, which was the focus how ASEA originally built, that you are able to be a system level supplier, solving the customer problem rather than just pushing the gear that you have. You can't do that if you're too small. I mean, you don't have the financial muscle to pull through those multi-year, multi-billion programs. So becoming bigger is pretty much was a necessity in order to remain competitive or to even remain viable in the marketplace.
Yeah, this very much feels like a TSM. Why don't we build a fab like TSMC built a fab? Well, actually, building a fab is not a 200 million euro affair. Right? It's going to cost you an awful lot of money. It's a high amount of risk, and you've got to know exactly what you're doing. So at the moment, at this point, the combined entity, the new ABB, 100 factories need to be closed, some of them in Sweden, some in Switzerland, some of them in Germany. Yeah, 200 others need to be merged. The R&D efforts need to also be refocused and reorientated to this new mission, right? And because Percy is a self-styled software guy, there's gonna be a software system involved, Marty. And I love this kind of story about Abacus. Yeah, very much kind of like moving the counting thing. So in August 1988, Barnvik basically says to the team, okay, I need a new software system. If I'm going to have this decentralized business with everything as a profit center, I need excellent information, right? And initially the team comes back going, yeah, that's fine. It'll take us 3 to 5 years. And he's like, you've got 10 months. And that's me being generous. I don't care what it costs. I don't care how many people it takes. And it's got to work perfectly from day one. And don't try and fool me because I've designed data systems myself. And that's your brief. Good luck.
Yeah. And I mean, let's remember, I mean, when we go to 1988, what was the status? What was the level of sophistication with enterprise resource management systems?
Yes.
I mean,
we're not talking SOC 2 compliance and APIs.
No,
at this stage.
we are talking about very, very simple. I mean, of course, ERP systems, they existed. Absolutely, they existed. But this was the time when many software suppliers were infamous for selling vaporware. So they sold, if you had the warehouse and production management system, if the sales guy was if the customer wanted to have a full integrated ERP system with all the financials included, the sales guy was happy to sell it, and then just call to the office and okay, I sold this comprehensive ERP system, and now you need to program the financials to it. I mean, that happened in the 80s, happened still in the 90s. So the concern of what you order is not what you get. That was absolutely critical. But on the other hand, how do you manage a company with 180,000 people? I mean, and of course, I mean, the number reduced a little bit. But I mean, how do you manage that? If you have 5,000 profit centers, how do you even follow how they are performing? How do you know that you are focusing on your corrective action on the actual root causes of poor performance, or are you just doing actions that sound enticing and effective? And in the whole thing, the love of numbers, the going deep into the numbers is one of the things that in 1988 was an admirable priority from Barnevik, because that was not necessarily the mainstream solution those days. And the same thing, what also goes here is that if you have 180,000 people to begin with, how do you communicate the stuff that you want to say? I mean, there was the interesting metaphor that if you want to keep the organization flat, people will have hard time remembering expressions like "we want a flatter organization." And instead of saying that, they said, "We don't want any sandwich," and that is, we don't have any unnecessary layers of management. And whoa, I don't want to be a sandwich man was then much easier to understand for the people. And one proverb that I've carried in my hard disk from since these days was when Barnevik said very famously said that large corporations have many problems. They tend to attract people who are comfortable in large organizations. And I just love the way that he expressed this fundamental challenge that any large organization has, and how you then transform that into something more agile and much more mission-oriented so that you can get rid of the extra unnecessary cost. It's a huge challenge of leadership to do that effectively without having everybody turning against you. It's a very fine line in being effective and becoming a jerk, because people don't want to follow a jerk. But if you are too weak, if you are too soft, you are not effective.
Exactly. And again, sometimes being effective is also designing the system so that people can actually do their job properly, right? So with just finishing off the Abacus thread, Abacus stands for ABB Accounting and Communication System. It tracked 32 performance measurements on 5,000 plus profit centers, compared actual performance and budgets with forecasts. The data would be collected in local currencies and then translated into US dollars to allow for more analysis cross borders. Right, now, the thing, and I heard that, I spoke to one of the former ABB financial group controllers, and he's like, my life got 90% better when they made that decision, right? Because comparing everything in local currencies was so time consuming, right? And when I spoke to him, he was like, Abacus, like literally, Abacus changed my life, right? This system enabled me to not just do the job, but I'm mired in the detail. I can't see anything and I don't feel I'm being effective. I'm just kind of keeping one step ahead of each other and I'm kind of grounded. This allowed me to basically actually create impact in the company. Yeah. Right? And he said the time before Abacus and the time after Abacus was just chalk and cheese. This was a transformational impact in the way of working. And he said what happened was when people started seeing the changes and that their lives got better and they could do more, then more people got behind the changes. So it was definitely phrases like the sandwich man that kind of told people what they needed to do or not do. But it was also then the examples of, oh my God, this is just better, right? And that's really what started happening. And you had whole parts of the organization, and I'm not really picking on Brown Boveri, but there were so many good examples there. You had this Brown Boveri International organization, right, which was basically several hundred people administrating Brown Boveri's export organization, mostly in developing countries. And you could get money from them, but they weren't a profit center. And when basically everything became a profit center, and there were hundreds of people saying in Brown Boveri International, who wants my services? And hundreds of people going, I don't need them.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And that very quickly reshaped the organization, almost not from a kind of top down perspective, but more a question of if you're a profit center, you have something of value to sell. You went around the organization, you found your internal or external buyers, and suddenly you had purpose, or you didn't have anything to sell and suddenly you were probably looking for a job elsewhere.
Yeah. And but there's another thing, which especially when we talk about government business, when you are selling to government, there's an interesting element. to this. I mean, EADS corporate, when it was established, they had also EADS International, exactly like Brown Boveri International, and an area where they may have, or at least had, value added is when you're dealing with governments, because governments as customers are very specific one, and it's very difficult to have a credible face if you go to see the Minister of Trade and Industry, and the Minister of Trade and Industry starts that, okay, you are the fifth delegation from ABB that I've seen during the last 2 weeks, and it's not everything is transaction. Some level of key account management, especially in the government or context, is probably needed. But indeed, in this particular case, the Brown Boveri International had become very, very big and very costly exercise that was not pulling its weight anymore.
Yeah, very much so. And I think this is where, if we think about one of the levers that the new ABB could pull, was the fact that they could take people from one business unit and take them to see another business unit to showcase effectively what the difference was. So again, one of the stories that I heard a couple of times was, look, you could sit down in the German office and you could explain to the German manager that he didn't need, and it was a he in this case, he didn't need 17 staff working for him, right? And he would intellectually argue that he did. And then all that ABB generally did was just fly the German guy to Finland and show him that the Finnish business unit was managing more than he was with a third of the staff.
Yeah.
And then it was actually really difficult to say, I need all those people. And again, this wasn't so much about a head count culling exercise. This was more about almost liberating the talent in the organization to do the work.
Yeah.
Right?
But
so it was real focus.
But as you know, Colin, the borderline between the building something new and ending up being actually just cutting the headcount, it's a very, very thin line.
Yeah.
And here, the thing that I admire in this story is that based, considering the humongous task at hand, they were able to stay on the let's say, building the future side rather than just becoming ruthless headcount cutters, and that's really amazing here, and of course has turned out to be very, very successful in retrospect.
Yeah, and one of the things I think that helped them there was using frameworks that were pioneered in SAO, which is like almost this T50 concept, right? Which Percy kind of did some work in Sandvik, then took to ASEA, then becomes this hallmark of ABB in terms of its kind of priorities, which is like, can you effectively cut the production time and get something to the customer faster? Right. So they give some really good examples here that the time for making high voltage DC transmission equipment gets cut from 3 years to 2 years, or the components division cuts cycle times from 86 to 35 days. And again, making the organizations flatter. And again, it's not Elon that brings white collar and blue collar workers together in the SpaceX hangar for the first time, and no one's ever done this. This is happening here, right? This is basically getting the managers to have their offices on the factory floor, right? This is getting everybody in a smaller, flatter organization with workers taking more responsibilities, and managers, basically fewer managers around. So they're changing their role from a policeman errand boy, and now they're a support function for the workers. And this is happening here in the 1980s all the way through.
Yeah, and I mean when we look back what happened, this is one of those cases where when you look at the kind of the dream, even the promise that a company that is proposing the board of directors a merger or acquisition of major scale, this is kind of the dream come true, that you have an industrial merger that is not only a bigger organization but also a better organization, where 1 + 1 is genuinely more than just 2. Just once again, getting back to the scale, thanks to even if there was some downside, some divestments took place, and the organizations were reorganized. By 1990, we are at $26 billion of revenue, 215,000 people, and the number of people were slowly going down. By 1994, we were almost $30 billion of revenue, 207,000 people, and $1.5 billion of earnings after financial items. So this is a world scale company with real authority. That is of course is the result why Barnevik becomes a global leader that starts to also attract all kinds of companies want to have him as a board member or as an advisor. So his reputation as this miracle rainmaker of European industry is of course getting here much larger. And what is interesting here is that I'd hate to use the word humble beginnings of his life, but let's say he was not somebody who was born into an aristocratic family. He hands down practical experience and approach to all these problems was very vivid. Remembered in his memoirs when he was invited. Then after all these things that he's done, he was invited to the industrial jet set circles to very things, and he was very much of the opinion that okay, I mean this is nice, but this is not the way how I used to think about this. I mean, Persu was an avid sailor, and he remembered in one case that when he was invited to some of these luxurious international jet set sailing events, it was quite a surprise when he went there and you had Michelin star chefs preparing food, whereas in his youth sailing trips they were happy to eat canned mussels and other basic food. So in a way he was with all the success and grandeur, he was still from the heart he was a very, very practical problem solver rather than turning out to be an aristocrat, even if his industrial track record at this time had made him a global figure.
Very much so. And like, I think we'll probably need to pause Percy a little bit because we need to tell more of the story. But there's no question he is a singular figure for the business. And I can't see a way that this merger plays out without him being involved. But remember, it's a two-stage rocket, listeners. So the first stage was do this restructure. And actually, they do that extremely well. It's not without pain. It's not without factories closing and people losing their jobs. We don't want to kind of oversight on this, but they do a very good job of effectively getting the new ABB entity into a very good place. But now they have to grow, right? The restructure was the first part of the job. There was a second part of the job. And the merger produces a pretty whopping big pile of cash. So they get a $4 billion pile of cash, half of which is immediately available for building global muscle. And they are now a European scale businesses. And the two businesses fit very well together. Like, say, a Nordic, Swiss, German, they're geographically complementary. They're complementary technology. They're complementary from a tax and legal perspective. They're complementary from a everybody speaks bad English perspective, from a culture perspective. There's lots of things in common. Now they need to grow. And I think one of the challenges here is that they have to grow very fast because they now have big rivals to compete with. Over the next few years, they commit 1.5 billion to basically on a buying spree. Yeah. And they basically buy all over the world. So there's it's pages and pages of the companies that they buy. They generally prefer to buy profitable business units rather than whole companies. They don't take minority positions. There's kind of a set of things that they do, but they do it everywhere and they do it all at once. And then one of the companies, and we're just going to put a little kind of flag in it at the moment, one of the companies they buy in November 1989 is a US company, a Stanford, Connecticut-based boiler and nuclear plant builder called Combustion Engineering. And the reason that they buy these guys is effectively because they need to grow in the US market. It's not good enough to basically just be a European scale business operating in Europe. They want to put on some American muscle. They try and buy a business out of GE. Jack Welch jacks the price up. So basically they don't end up buying it. It's too expensive. But they buy a lot. They buy it quickly. and combustion engineering is one of those. They also continue their diversity agenda and international. I don't mean that in terms of equity. I mean in terms of getting the Swiss managers to train the Polish managers, get the Polish managers to train the Hungarian managers, get the Hungarian managers to train the Indian managers, get the Indian managers to train the Swiss managers. And they bring the best talent from all over the world, and they basically use that talent base in the same way they use the Percy's the investigation group, that talent base, to train each other. There's a lot of cross-fertilization that takes place to really create this act global, act local type vibe and that sort of company branding. So when you're thinking of the kind of second part of this plan, the kind of growth plan, it's everywhere all at once, and it's a real international talent base that gets brought to bear.
Yeah, and I mean the case of the combustion engineering is of course a very sad one. There were people that were genuinely affected by asbestos everywhere in the world because it turned out to be very, very bad for your health. But what's interesting here is that first of all, probably insufficient due diligence. They didn't anticipate this issue at ABB, but also there was a story that in United States there was a court that essentially ruled that everybody who has ever worked for a company in charge of the asbestos problems, regardless whether you got sick, even regardless of whether you were exposed to asbestos, even if you worked just in the office, if you worked for the company who has been found guilty for asbestos-related health issues, you have a right to be compensated. So the whole story blew out of proportion, and I mean you were just dealt with if you were essentially as part of the combustion engineering, there was a poison pill called asbestos that hurt, and in addition to the financial hurt that was huge, but it was also the end of the honeymoon. I mean, all of a sudden ABB was not the stellar success story. You started having rough edges in your beautiful story, and that became then also very, very challenging for many people around ABB, in addition to Barnevik himself.
Yeah, and it all goes very bad very quick, sadly. So we definitely park the honeymoon side, and basically the poison pill of combustion engineering almost takes down the group. Right? So the liabilities that sit within this American firm are so big that effectively it almost threatens the survival of ABB. So 2001, 2002 is when this kind of breaks. And it's not just a bad quarter. It's at the point where ABB almost goes out of existence, right? Having had this amazing honeymoon, this amazing success, and then effectively the liabilities inside this one business that they've acquired almost takes out the group. And I think this causes, it's a massive problem. There's no question about it. This is huge for ABB, right? This is existential, right? But also it then basically causes the share price to collapse, the people to question everything that went before. It's not just the financial impact of this. This is like a health scare. Like this is a company, I'm going to die. Right. So everything that's associated with the old, which is the kind of decentralized, move fast. I'm not going to say break things, but move fast and deal with the problems if you break things. Right. And kind of almost Swedish kind of ASEA management culture. And there's all the Swiss leaders in here as well. That kind of gets all questioned. And now it becomes back to, we have to know where all our pounds and shillings and pence are, right? We have to know what everybody's doing. If decentralization caused these problems, then only centralization and survival will solve that. So ABB does a massive pivot at this stage.
Yeah. And I mean, it's even, I think it's even worse than that. I mean, everybody wants to be with you when you are successful, when you are growing, when you have great news to report. Everybody wants to have their piece of success, and you have friends everywhere. And when things go sour, and your reputation is tarnished by something that, for example, in this case, combustion engineering, you didn't have an active role even with the issues that happened. You just happened to buy the company that turns out to be a bad apple. People start fleeing. I mean, you have people in your organization that are starting to question whether this is something that I want to be involved with. You have your board members, you have some of your investors, your owners that all of a sudden said, "Oh, we were very happy to be with you when everything was hunky dory, but now that it turns out to be that you have this dark side of your soul, we may want to distance ourselves so that we are not getting tarnished." And then this is a very, very important lesson. And why do I raise this specific point? We today live in an era where everybody wants to be in defense, but defense is inherently is uh, is a potential reputational risk, and sooner or later we will have companies that came to defense with great enthusiasm, and they were seeing dollars and euros that they can make in being in this business, but sooner or later there will be some public image challenges to tackle, and then the question is, are your investors going to be on board? Are your key members of your management team, your board members, how well they are prepared to handle the bad news? Because there will be bad news. Your company will be in the middle of a PR crisis sooner or later. And then the question is that what can you do in advance to prepare yourself to the moment when manure hits the fan, and whether your key stakeholders, your investors, are they ready to take the heat? And in the case of ABB and combustion engineering, we saw a case where many of the stakeholders could not take the heat.
Yeah. So Marty, how does this all play out? The stock price has basically gone to the gutter, right? Where the combustion engineering thing has all blown up, right? And then we end up with this, and we don't want to over dramatize this, but we've been so positive about Per Se throughout this period, right? Basically, there's this pension scandal that kind of breaks, right? And it's not really a pension scandal, it's a pension payment in this case. But it's basically the fact that Per Se over time has accumulated, because of the value he's created, this almost insane bonus pool, right? And this all comes public. It's kind of, whether it's a board leak or something else, this all plays out annoyingly in public, and people kind of flee for the hills.
But I want to say there, I don't want to get into the details on what is right and what is wrong. It is clear that Barnevik himself felt that it was something that was clearly agreed, and it was agreed by competent representative of the company. And even if the sums of money may sound large, but they are not unusual when we talk about senior directors of large international industrial corporations. So I don't really want to get into where what is right and what is wrong. All I want to say is that the whole story around that time, it really emphasized and demonstrated how when the going gets tough, some people will just jump ship and try to save their faces rather than staying with the company at a time when the company actually needs the best possible support in order to bring the continued value to the shareholders.
Yeah, so to just be clear, listeners, so Per Se's moved on from ABB as CEO. He retires when he's 55, and then basically stays on as chairman. He's still chairman of Sandvik. He's chairman of the Investor, the Wallenberg Family Investor Group. He's super active. He's on a bunch of boards. This all kind of breaks afterwards. He's handed over to a successor. And then, and this is going to feel very sad for me, this next period in the 2000s to the 2020s feels a little bit like UK prime ministers over the last 10 years, Marty. Right? This
Indeed.
feels like a succession of characters, right? Now, whether they were an amazing person, they just had a ridiculously difficult set of cards dealt to them, and they did their best job with a ridiculous set of cards, and then they moved on or pushed out, or they're a terrible character and basically they were going to blow it up anyway. It doesn't really matter. We then have from basically a succession of characters all dealing with the aftermath of combustion engineering, all dealing with this personality clash that ABB is kind of going through, which is it centralized? Is it decentralized? Is it a profit center? Is it close to the customer? There's a lot happens over this period, and we're not going to go into each and single one of the characters, but there is a lot of churn during this period. And a kind way of saying this is ABB experimenting, recovering, testing hypotheses. Some of the moves are intelligent, some of them less. And this kind of happens over this kind of period from the early 2000s to the kind of mid and early 2020s.
Yeah.
Right? It's ABB kind of thrashing around. It's kind of a result of the explosion that's just happened.
Yeah, and it's a sad story because the foundation has not rotted all of a sudden.
Yeah.
I mean, if we talk about the technological and industrial capabilities that are within the group, I mean, they didn't disappear all of a sudden. I mean, the company in a way is great all through these years, but clearly it there appears to be different opinions on what is the right direction and what is the right strategy for the company. And I mean, it almost feels like at times the ship has been somewhat adrift in stormy ocean. And I have no way of saying which one of these CEOs or chairs of the company have succeeded better or worse. It's just been a very, very rough patch.
Definitely.
And in a way, there was a clear recovery if we jump forward to Björn Rosengren, who started in 2020. He was clearly able to, let's say, take control of the health. And of course, what is interesting is that he came there as a part of the presence of Sparkmind.Capital in ABB. Do you want to say something about Cevian?
Yeah, so look, I think if people are not familiar with Cevian, I think it's a fascinating group in its own, and we were very fortunate to talk to them as part of this discussion, the preparation for the podcast. But I've been following them for a number of years. So Cevian is a Swedish activist investor. Now, activist investors generally get a bad rap because they're generally Americans, and they're generally very short-termistic. And they're very focused on kind of forcing change. This is not an American activist investor. This is very much this is almost doing private equity in the public markets, right? And they very much focus on taking concentrated positions in companies for a 10 to 15 year period. So this is them betting their money into these companies, not for short-term gain, but for long-term gain. Yeah, now long-term in this case is 10 to 15 years and afterwards, rather than long-term being 100 years. And they're a very thesis-driven investment. And the reason why I like talking to them and I studied them for a number of years is because they always have a view. And it's not the stock price is undervalued. That's part of it. It's always like, there has to be a good underlying business here. They have to basically probably be out of kilter with the market. So like the margins for ABB were definitely lower than their margins for their competitors. There has to be technology leadership. There has to be good positioning in the right market. And there almost has to be something that's holding the company back from basically going from good to great again. So again, ABB for Cevian, and this is all public, it's all out there, so you can read it. The ABB ticks all these boxes, right? The business, even though this, it's the classic "I am not my stock price," right? The stock price might have been in the gutter, but there's still a decent business under here that's worth way more than the cash on the stock. So basically, in 2015, Cevian basically takes a position with ABB, and they do this very publicly. So they build up a 5% stake in ABB in 2015. Okay, they actively push basically ABB into kind of diversifying the things that don't make any sense, where there's no synergies in the business, or certainly weak synergies in the business. And they start doing this in 2016. Lars, who's one of the founders of Cevian, steps onto the board. And again, it's quite funny. There's a parallel here to Asea in the old days. Cevian very much describes itself as, invited, not invading. They're not trying to go in and tell the company what to do. They're trying to basically help from the outside to the inside. So basically, after quite a few years, ABB and Sikli Sunday under Bjorn, they make active approaches to sell off their power grids business, initially to Hitachi. And they also then, and they were looking to spin it out, but they end up also selling off their robotics division to SoftBank. Now, SoftBank's got a huge history with robotics, so it's not a massive surprise that they're interested in this one. And then over this kind of, we're 2026 now, over this 10-year period, and recently they've started selling down their position and Lars has stepped off the board. Now, this is not all about Cevian, but what's interesting is that they saw the value in the business, but they also saw that the business needed to change. It needed to simplify. It needed to kind of reduce its head office, which had increased over the kind of, the danger zone period of combustion engine. And it needed to get back to doing something that looked more like category leadership. There's no question during this period that ABB, 2001 to kind of 2020, doesn't act like a category leader anymore, right? There's a 20-year kind of period where they kind of lose the crown, and now they need to basically win it back.
Yeah. And what is, of course, interesting, clearly when we talk about Björn Rosengren, he established the ABB way, where decentralization, accountability, and fast decision-making are cores to the way of work. When I've been looking at the corporate, the way how the corporate has been talking about the strategy, it's been, the only thing that I can get is a warm and fuzzy feeling. They have not been very clear in pointing the corporate identity. Yes, even the strategy is decentralized, but I've been hoping to get a clearer picture on what the corporate is actually up to. The investors are very happy because the stock price has been quite high and rising over the last few years, and of course the divestment of the robotics is a key point, and I'm all in favor of reassessing which parts of the corporate are still current, and there needs to be activities back and forth. What is interesting is that about with the same amount of money that they are allegedly getting from the divestment of robotics, ABB very recently announced in mid-July, 2 days ago, when we are recording this on the 17th, they announced that they are buying a British company which is in the factory automation part. It's a company called Rotar, and Rotar PLC, and the enterprise value is around 5.5 billion. And what is important is that the current CEO, Morten Viros, said that ABB is looking at further M&A even beyond this British recent acquisition. So indeed, they are building something new, but what this new is and how they prioritize what they are really focusing into and what is the new direction that they get, I don't have a clear picture. But I'm very happy to see that they are at least they are doing very deliberate steps in reshaping and reinventing the company in order to maintain the category leader status that we have very happily given to ABB.
Yeah, and again, as we bring this story to a close, listener, and we're going to move into our analysis section in a second. But again, I think this is one of the ones that the reason we wanted to tell ABB's story is there is so much value, we believe, for founders today. So many of the lessons that ABB went through in its various forms are current lessons for today. Also, category leadership, like product market fit, is not forever, right? Just because you basically get product market fit with your, B2B accounting app today doesn't mean that you have it tomorrow. Markets change, customers change, needs change, competitors change. Category leadership, certainly global category leadership, is a continual pursuit of excellence, right? And we've seen this with every company we've covered so far, that actually it's that long-term journey that these businesses and the employees and investors and owners have to go on. So ABB may be in a more unclear position today, but then so's OpenAI, right? Anthropic 2 years ago was nothing like Anthropic today. So again, these things change. And it's important to basically be very clear on what you're doing and how you're doing it, and really continue to bet the farm and keep driving forward. And if there's a lesson there in ABB, that's one of the lessons that I've certainly taken away.
Yeah. And what I'd be expecting, the fundamental cornerstones of ABB strategy, which are electrification and automation, those are solid building blocks for the company going forward, because it's the electricity is only going to be more and more important going forward. That's absolutely clear. But the question is that I would just like to understand a little bit better what they have in mind, because I know that they have more rabbits to pull from the hat, or more aces that are coming from their sleeve going forward, and definitely looking forward to hearing more on how they are currently seeing the future of the company.
Yeah, and when we say how, I think we need to be very precise, Marty, right? We don't need buzzwords. ABB doesn't report to us. We don't need buzzwords. We need clarity, right? Automation is kind of a hand-wavy word, right? It's kind of lost its value now.
Yeah,
right.
And electrification is not very precise either.
That's my point, right? We don't just need we've got data centers, big number goes up type text. And again, ABB don't report to us. That's not the point. For ABB to regain their category leadership, they'll need to communicate their strategy very clearly to their employees, hundreds of thousands of them, and they've got to be very clear on where they're going. And I would contrast that to look at someone like Jensen Huang, NVIDIA, right? Look at how he talks about his business, and look at sadly in Europe, we don't do this as well. We don't communicate sharply and clearly what it takes to win. And at times, ABB has done that brilliantly. And when they've done that, they've been at their best. And at times when they've gone all corporate and fuzzy on us, right? Yeah, then it's been a little bit 10% more, 10% too many people and 10% not enough revenue has come and bitten them on the ass. So I think we need to hear that sharpness to see where their category leadership is going to go in the future.
Indeed. And it's critical because it's a public company. And there are a lot of people who have the right to know that. But I'm so confident that the story is there somewhere. It just needs to be told in a clear and concise way, without the let's say the management talk that is put together by either AI or junior consultants of the major firms. Just say it simply so that everybody understands.
Yeah, exactly. No sandwich, man. Let's go. Okay, so let's move forward to the analysis section. So on this side, Marty and I park the narrative, and we look back utilizing Hamilton Helmer's 7 powers, and we look at where the company sits today. So again, if we look at scale economies, the whole story is about generating scale economies. These are real, they are very important, and they have been generated over time. This is back to it's 5 to 7 times more expensive to do this stuff than it's previously. You have to have scale economies. ABB definitely has them.
Yeah, and the big question there is that we haven't actually touched is the importance of the service business, and ABB for a long period of time has been committed to have these recurring services, even for customers who are operating equipment that is not originally ABB supplied. So it'll be interesting to see how this service side of business will continue now that the corporate is reshaping its future.
Yeah, and there's no question electrification of everything is a rising trend, and obviously rising tides float markets. The question there really is how can ABB use their scale economies to really drive category leadership for me, right? I want to see without repeating what we just said, I want to see more on that. Because generally, if we look at the next power, they don't really have network economies, right? This is not that sort of business. right? Obviously there's some vestige of that, but it's weak for them in comparison to other businesses. You
I
don't become
agree.
an ABB customer because someone else is.
But I have a question there, and I'm not expecting us to answer this right now. Is that if you think of what ABB does, is that they are essentially operating in the, like I mentioned earlier, the lingua franca of energy. So is there a network? Is there a platform that is actually behind the scenes? Is in the core of everything that they do? They are just not necessarily communicating that element as a network or a platform. But I wonder if there is one.
Okay. No, that's a good question. This is the Airbus kind of Skywise platform that effectively powers their total business, that
Yeah.
effectively gives them an amazing network effect because half of
Yeah.
Boeing's data is in basically Airbus's data system.
Yeah. But I agree. Uh, as far as the analysis that we have found, it appears to be weak. All I'm saying is that it doesn't have to be that way.
Agreed. Okay, and again, counter positioning is difficult because for large corporates because effectively they tend to spread risk and they can't turn on a dime, and nor should they. But today, again, I need to see how ABB counter positions. I'm not seeing that as a power today. I'm definitely seeing that as a power in the past. Like, Percy's Abacus system, like doing heavy software engineering back in the 90s, that was a counter positioning move. Nobody else was doing that.
Yeah, exactly the point. Once again, as this is a large corporation, it may be that there are elements like that, but they are deeper inside the operations of the various subsidiaries and business areas. We just don't appear to be finding that from the sources that we went through.
Yeah, and again, listeners, we talk to current employees, we talk to former employees, we talk to competitors, former and current competitors. We talk to executives, we talk to board members, we talk to anybody who will have a conversation with us.
Who will talk
But
to us? Yeah.
obviously, anyone will talk to us. But so we don't cover everything on this podcast, but we cover a lot. So we go as deep as we can. So switching costs, this is a big one, right? You don't change your power system every 5 minutes, right? There's this lovely stat going around the internet recently that nearly every single 50% of power generating systems in the US are over 30 years old, right? That kind of tells you how often this stuff gets switched out.
Yeah. But yet again, here the challenge is that when a lot of the electrical systems are based on standards, so you don't have this vendor lock-in position either. You in many cases you need to adapt, you need to integrate your deliverable to an existing infrastructure. And, once again, I would assume, I get the feeling that there is there's a genuine danger that some of this stuff will become commodities. There are great things like the marine propulsion based on Azipods, which are very, very unique, and the switching cost is very high. But then an ongoing question then, how much of the stuff that they do is actually in danger of becoming commodities because there is competition and there are players. And then the question is that how much in the M&A activity of ABB can still consolidate the marketplace so that there is less competition and more streamlined opportunities for the company to succeed in the long run.
Yeah, I always find this quite difficult, right? Because if you're not inside the deal, you don't know the detail. But there's that bumper sticker in the US, which is when the going gets tough, the tough go shopping, right? Right. And often I see corporate M&A with that regard. When the going gets tough, we're going to distract ourselves by buying other people's businesses. Right. Now, sometimes you buy for technology leadership and you buy for market positioning. And actually, like Stromberg, you get a crown jewel. Right. And there's no question in my mind, and Marty, I'd be interested in your opinion. Stromberg flourishes during this
Still,
period.
still,
Yeah,
I mean that.
it's doing an amazing job. Whereas
Yeah,
previously it would have been locked into a small market, selling everything, rather than becoming extremely good, king of king of motors, etc., rather than peasants of the other thing. Actually they flourish on this side. So this can work really well if there's a very clear plan
yeah,
behind it.
yeah, and the bottom line being that even if there is some, even if we have some questions on ABB today, the company continues to be great. But I guess the key question is to which degree there is the danger that the company could be more valuable when split into pieces and divested little by little, or is ABB as an integrated conglomerate as it is today, is it still pulling more than the sum of its parts?
Yeah, so that takes us nicely. I genuinely think their strongest power is process power, right? So if you skip to the end, it's kind of like, what are they really, really good at, right? That actually holds this business together. And actually, there's a huge amount of technological leadership and process work that they still do better than nearly anybody else. Right. And you kind of want to see them double down on, like, this is kind of like, the TSMC of electrification, right? Can they just be better at doing the thing that they're very good at doing and continue to push the frontier in this particular space at a time when we're going back to 1974 curve where electricity demand is actually going up for a change. So we fell it off in 1974. We're actually kind of coming back kind of 50 plus years later with electricity demand coming forward. Can ABB become the company that delivers on that agenda?
Yeah, and in a way, I think we are doing this podcast in a less than perfect timing, because I believe that the story will evolve and have new shades of beautiful colors in a year or two.
Yeah, it's fine. We can definitely come back to it on this side. So look, I think to summarize the 7 powers section, I think process power and switching costs are very strong. Scale economies and cornered resource are good. And then kind of everything else is secondary for them, right?
Yeah.
This is a business that doesn't perform well in the margin, so it's better on that side. Okay, so Martys, let's step back. We've told the story. We've done the analysis. Maybe the timing isn't quite right in terms of telling the full story. It's always nice to have a more satisfactory conclusion than we've reached to. But when you step back and look at this company as a whole, what's your kind of final thoughts? What's your quintessence on this one?
I mean, I genuinely, yes, they are very, very important operators in the electrification and automation domain. I give them that. The only area that I'm not fully comfortable is I'd like to understand more about their strategy going forward. As it is today, the corporate is not in a stable situation. They will not remain the way they are. They either will shrink or they will grow. And based on the CEO's comments from earlier this week, I mean just this week, they have the intention to grow, but they are not in a stable side. And I just hope that they are able to make bold moves. I mean, there are competitors that still have operations that could be consolidated, because fundamentally, my bottom line here being, we are proud and we are celebrating the companies that are based and they are grown in Europe and they become global category leaders. Dominating Europe is not going to be enough. In order to compete with Asian nations and with American companies, you need to do more. You just need to do more. And of course, that is very easy for us to say from the comforts of our podcast studio. But it's still, I think they need to find the vision. I mean, the passion and vision that Persu had in his time. They need the same level of passion of growing the company to something even more than what it is today. But that's my feeling, and it gives me a very restless feeling altogether on where we are today. I just don't feel that this is not the place where you can stand and stay.
Agreed. And I think you summed it up really well. It sounds crazy for these very large company. They're either playing offensive or they're playing defensive. You can see this all the way through their history, right? They've been at their best when they have played offensive, where they have gone and taken on the global competitors. Yeah, where they've beaten GE in their own market. And they did. They won deals from GE with the Tennessee Valley Authority, one of the biggest deals in America. Where they've played offensive, whether that was Brown Boveri winning the deal or ASEA winning the deal, they have been brilliant. And when they've played defensive and acted more like a holding company, like Berkshire Hathaway for electricity, they're not that good, right? Because it's not their core competency. Like if you're a holding company, be a holding company. But if you're going to be effectively a category leading company that's at the forefront of electricity automation, you have to act that. You have to deliver on that promise. You have to go offensive. And that's kind of where I see that the lesson there is in their history. I really hope they deliver on this. I have so much respect for this company and what they've achieved so far, and I want them to 10x it going forward.
Here, here.
Okay, so let's do some thank yous. So a big thank you at my side to Michael Klintberg, who is a 28-year-old veteran of ABB that introduced me to so many people. Like, he is just a complete star. He went out of his way to basically connect me with his network inside the company, both past and present. So a big thank you to Michael. You've done an amazing job. Also, a big thank you to Claudia, who's the co-author of ABB's The Dancing Giant with Kevin Barnum. Claudia was very good at getting on the call and talking me through not just what happened in the book and the making of the book, but what happened since then and the stories around Percy and his charitable work. That was particularly invaluable. Big thank you to ABZ executive team who got on the call and basically past and present and really stepped up to allow me to understand the nuance in this business. And also Sevian Capital, I mentioned them earlier. They, again, were very thesis-driven. They were clear and articulated their thesis, and that really helped me frame it, and hopefully I did a good job in conveying it in this podcast. So many thank yous from my side, Marty. And, I don't know if you want to shout out any individuals. You talk to a lot of people as well.
Yeah, well, I don't want to go to any people, but I want to recommend that anybody who is interested in the ABB history is to read the autobiography of Barnevik, which is called Jag vill förändra världen. I want to change the world. I didn't find it in English. It was in Swedish, but it's very beautifully written. It's easy to go through if you know the language. And it tells another side of Barnevik's personality after retired from the industrial roles, where he has been donating a lot of his money to all kinds of projects all around the world. And one of his statements, which he didn't invent himself, but he was saying, the one who dies rich will die in shame. That is, if you have been successful enough to gather a lot of wealth, you need to be sharing that money with the people in need before you go away. And sadly, it's actually today, or actually tomorrow, is the 1 year anniversary of Barnevik's passing. He died July 18, 2025, which is actually a year ago tomorrow.
Yeah, look, and again, don't want to turn it into too much of a Percy kind of tribute, but definitely look at the body of work that he did post leaving ABB. Right, the amount of charitable work and the foundation work and the way that he approached it, if you've not looked at what he did, it's very impressive. Both in the corporate space, but also in the kind of not-for-profit space. He took exactly the same attitude to transparency and data and standards there as he did in his work in ASEA, Sandvik, and ABB.
Yeah.
So,
and I mean, and there's one little detail that I wanna say. We were talking about men, women, Percy's boys, and all this. But one of the interesting thing is that when he's been giving been in an organized way, giving these small loans to all kinds of people in developing countries, what he said that you typically cannot trust any men, because typically what happens is that if you give them goats, they will sell that and drink all the money that they get. If you soft loans, small loans, they will drink the money and not do anything meaningful. The only people who you can trust are women and mothers, because they will spend all the money that they get. They will spend that for the well-being of the families and their societies. And he was even criticized at one point of not loaning any money for men for this reason. But that was also it was not based on any sexism or anything like that. It was just based on the actual findings, what happens when you trust many men with too much money.
Of course. And he was also quite outspoken on not employing expats in countries that he was working in, because he was like, how is that close to the customer? You just need a bigger salary and not that close to the problem. That doesn't work.
Exactly. So very, very pragmatic all through the activities until the very end of his life.
Okay, so we have covered Sweden, Nordics. We have covered Switzerland. So next month, listeners, we're going to stay in the Nordics. And we're going to tell the story, a Norwegian story this time. And we're looking at how we go from electricity to oil, right? So if we think about oil, it's kind of stored energy, stored power, sunlight kind of locked deep underground, kind of fossils of creatures long gone away. And one of the greatest stories, and Marty and I looked at a bunch of different Norwegian companies, one of the greatest story of Norwegian achievements is not just getting the oil and gas out of the ground. Sadly, Britain did that as well. The question is how to convert that buried inheritance from, beings passed on to outlast the wells themselves. So if ABB was a story about turning electricity into industrial capability, then next month's category leader, the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, is the story of turning oil into financial capability. And the scale of this achievement is extraordinary. The fund is currently worth roughly 20 trillion Norwegian kroner, which is roughly, depending on the exchange rate, $1.7 to $1.9 trillion. It owns about 1.5% of all the listed companies in the world. And it means it's not just a national savings account, it's one of the most important capital allocation machines ever built. So, Marty, are you excited about Norway next month?
Well, there are many, many good reasons to be excited about Norway, including their success in the world football, which was even if
very
at
impressive.
one point your countrymen then killed that dream. But there's a lot to like in Norway, and what I specifically like when we start covering Oljefondet, which is a casual name for the is that we get a chance to cover a category leading investor, because most of the companies, practically all the companies we've covered so far, they are the companies that are being invested to, rather than being invested. Well, the first one, when we had Baillie Gifford, that was the only one that has been an investor. And now, after covering successful companies, we get back to the investors, and that's of course interest. And there's the interesting comparison with UK. So we are in the UK-Norway domain all the time. Both of these nations found oil in the same general geographical region, but these two nations addressed the proceedings of this oil very differently. So there's an interesting counterpoint to continue this Norway-England challenge, and let's see what happens. But it's an interesting and a fun story that has been covered in many sources. There's even a pretty nice TV series that was produced some years ago about Oljefondet.
Absolutely. And look, again, we are definitely going to have to do the UK-Norway comparison, because obviously they both found the oil and the gas and basically did something very different with it. And I think everybody in England would probably swap winning to beating Norway in the recent World Cup for a sovereign wealth fund of 1.9 trillion. I think that's a bet everybody would take. But this will also feel a little bit familiar to other previous listeners, because the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund owns 7,200 listed company stocks worldwide. It has 1,389 property investments. It holds thousands of bonds, and it has offices all over the world. And for category leader listeners, they are also holders of Roche and ASML and EssilorLuxottica and last month's episode, Kone. So for me, this feels a little bit like we did with the Bailey Gifford series. This is like a coming home. We're looking at, again, a category leader that makes its money owning category leaders.
Yeah.
So it's going to be like a bookend to the Bailey Gifford series. So please join us next month when we will tell the story of basically creating value and protecting a nation for the long term, and the story of the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund. So join us next month.
Thank you so much.